They say the Rideau Canal is a place of reflection. Its waters, dark and rhythmic, have witnessed centuries of Canadian history, carrying the silent weight of a nation's growth. But in the pre-dawn chill of June 30th, 2009, those waters became a mirror reflecting a horror that the human mind struggles to process, a darkness that didn't come from the sky, but from within the heart of a family. Imagine, for a moment, the heavy silence of a summer night in Kingston, Ontario, broken not by the wind, but by the mechanical, rhythmic push of one car against another. Beneath the placid surface of the Kingston Mills locks, a silver Nissan Sentra rested upside down in the silt, holding a secret that would shatter the curated facade of a wealthy, perfect immigrant family. This wasn't a tragedy born of a missed turn, a slick road, or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a cold, clinical execution, a cleansing of 3 daughters and a wife, sacrificed on the altar of a father's archaic, twisted notion of honor. In the world of Muhammad Shafia, love was a transaction of obedience, and purity was a currency worth more than the blood of his own children. As the heavy tow truck slowly hoisted that metallic tomb from the depths, the world began to realize that some cages aren't made of iron and stone. They are built from the rigid, suffocating expectations of a patriarch who viewed his own flesh and blood as property to be discarded once it lost its perceived value. This is the story of the Shafia family, the heavy price of an honor that was never truly honorable, and the 4 voices that were silenced beneath the waves of the Rideau Canal. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To truly understand the chilling resolution of this case, we have to peel back the layers of a family hierarchy that was as rigid as it was deceptive. It begins with the patriarch, Muhammad Shafia. Born in 1951 in Kabul, Afghanistan, Muhammad was a man forged in a culture of absolute male authority and mercantile ambition. By the time he reached adulthood, he wasn't just a businessman. He was a tycoon, a trader who could turn electronics, real estate, and imports into a vast fortune. But in Muhammad's world, wealth was nothing without a legacy, and a legacy required heirs. In 1979, he married his first wife, Rona Amir Muhammad. By all accounts, Rona was a woman of immense grace and traditional devotion. She followed Muhammad across borders, supporting his rise to power. But as the years turned into a decade, a heavy silence fell over their marriage. Rona could not conceive. In the traditional patriarchal circles Muhammad inhabited, this was viewed as a catastrophic failure, a biological debt that Rona could never repay. Instead of compassion, she found herself facing the cold reality of Muhammad's ambition. In 1987, seeking to secure his lineage, Muhammad took a second wife, the much younger, fertile Tuba Muhammad Yahya. This was the first fracture in the family's foundation. In many parts of the world, polygamy is a recognized social structure. But in the Shafia household, it became a tool for psychological warfare. Tuba quickly provided what Rona could not: 7 children in rapid succession. As Tuba's status rose with every birth, Rona was systematically dismantled. She wasn't just the first wife anymore. She was the secret wife, a woman forced to live in the shadows of her own home. When the family moved from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and then to the gleaming artificial luxury of Dubai, Rona was brought along not as a partner, but as a domestic servant, a cousin or a nanny, to hide the illegal nature of Muhammad's bigamy from the modern world. By 1992, the family was settled in Dubai, living a life of immense privilege. Muhammad's business flourished, allowing him to house his family in high-end villas and drive the finest cars. But this wealth was a gilded cage. It was here that the 3 eldest daughters, Zainab, Sahar, and Geeti, began to form their identities under the watchful, predatory eyes of their father and their brother, Hamid. Muhammad didn't see his daughters as developing human beings. He saw them as assets whose value was entirely dependent on their purity. If they were compliant, they were prized. If they were defiled by independent thought, they were liabilities. Zainab, the eldest at 19 by the time they reached Canada, was a girl of fire and spirit. She was the first to realize that the world outside their villa didn't operate on her father's rules. She watched her brother, Hamed, be groomed as the little general, given freedom and authority simply by virtue of his gender, while she was expected to be a ghost. Sahar, 17, was the strategist. She learned to navigate the world through deception, living a double life that required an exhausting amount of energy. She was a bright, promising student with dreams of the medical field, but she knew those dreams were a direct threat to Muhammad's control. And then there was Giti, only 13. She was the most vulnerable, yet the most vocal. She was a child who understood intuitively that the honor her father spoke of was actually a shroud. In 2007, the Shafias made their final move, to Montreal, Canada. Muhammad purchased a large, respectable home in the St. Leonard borough, presenting his family as the ultimate immigrant success story. To the neighbors, they were wealthy, religious, and perfectly adjusted. But inside, the Western air was acting as a catalyst for a domestic explosion. The girls saw Canadian women walking freely, choosing their own partners, and pursuing careers. For Zainab, the sight was a revelation. For Muhammad, it was a poison. He began to view his daughter's fascination with Canada as a personal insult, a vile infection that he blamed on the filth of Western culture. He didn't see their desire for education as a path to success. He saw it as a path to prostitution. His language in the home became increasingly violent, fueled by a toxic mix of religious extremism and a fragile ego. He wasn't just a father losing his grip, he was a ruler facing a rebellion. And in the center of this storm was Rona, the auntie who saw everything. She became the girl's only confidant, the only person who understood that the luxury surrounding them was just a distraction from the darkness creeping through the hallways. As 2009 approached, the golden cage was no longer enough to hold the girls back, and Muhammad Shafia decided that if the cage was broken, the inhabitants would have to be destroyed. The union between Muhammad Shafia and Tuba Yahya was never a simple matter of the heart. It was a merger of tradition and strategic acquisition designed to secure a legacy that Muhammad felt was slipping through his fingers. By 1987, Muhammad had already spent a decade married to Rona Amir Muhammad, a woman who had been his companion through the early years of his rise to wealth. But in the cold, mercantile logic that governed Muhammad's soul, Rona was a depreciating asset. She was unable to provide him with children, and in the patriarchal landscape he inhabited, a man without sons is a man without a future. When Tuba entered the picture, she was young, fertile, and understood the assignment perfectly. She wasn't just coming into the home as a second wife, she was coming in as the architect of Muhammad's dynasty. For Rona, the arrival of the younger woman was the beginning of a long, agonizing erasure. The two women lived in a state of forced, suffocating proximity, a domestic arrangement that Muhammad controlled with an iron hand. As the years passed and the family moved from the dusty streets of Kabul to the gleaming, artificial towers of Dubai, the power dynamic crystallized. Tuba provided the children, 7 of them, and with each birth, her status as the true mother grew, while Rona was relegated to the status of a live-in servant, a woman whose only value was her labor. In Dubai, the family lived in a golden cage, a world of immense luxury where every need was met, but every movement was monitored. Muhammad's business empire was thriving, and he used his wealth to build a fortress around his family. It was here, amidst the marble floors and high-walled villas, that the honeymoon phase of their life was defined by a quiet, underlying tension. Tuba was not a victim in this household. She was Muhammad's most trusted lieutenant. She was the one who enforced the rules when Muhammad was away on business, the one who ensured the daughters remained pure and compliant. They were a unified front, a wall of traditional authority that the children were never meant to climb. But the move to Canada in 2007 changed the air they breathed. Montreal was a city of vibrant, unapologetic freedom, and for the Shafia daughters, it was like stepping from a black-and-white world into a kaleidoscope of color. The first red flags didn't appear as grand gestures of rebellion. They appeared in the small, quiet choices the girls began to make. It started with the way they looked at the world outside their windows, the way they lingered at the school gates, the way they began to question why their brother, Hamed, was allowed to exist in a world of freedom while they were confined to a world of shadows. Zainab, the eldest, was the first to truly test the bars of the cage. At 19, she was a woman grown, and she began to chafe under the 9 p.m. curfews and the constant inspection of her private thoughts. She fell in love, a simple human act that in any other home would be a rite of passage, but in the Shafia home, it was a declaration of war. Mohammed didn't see a daughter finding her path. He saw a stain on his property. He began to suspect her of every Western sin, his mind twisting her desire for a normal life into something vile and prostituted. Sahar, only 17, saw the fallout of Zainab's rebellion and chose a different path, a double life. This was the slow burn of the tragedy, the daily, exhausting effort to hide her true self. She would leave the house in traditional attire, her face a mask of obedience, only to transform the moment she reached the safety of school. She had a secret boyfriend, a secret Facebook account, and a secret dream of becoming a doctor, a dream where she didn't have to look over her shoulder. But in a house of 7 children, secrets have a way of leaking out. Hamed, acting as the little general, became his sister's shadow. He followed them. He checked their browser histories. He was the eyes and ears of a patriarch who was slowly losing his grip on his most prized assets. The relationship between the parents and the daughters had shifted from one of protection to one of predatory observation. The house in Montreal was no longer a home. It was a pressure cooker of resentment and fear. Even Rona, the auntie who had no children of her own, tried to intervene. She saw the girls as her own daughters, the only light in her life of hell. She tried to plead their case to Mohammed, but her voice carried no weight in a house where she had been systematically dehumanized. She began to fear for her own life, writing in her diary about Mohammed's growing volatility and Tuba's cold, calculated cruelty. As the summer of 2009 approached, the tension reached a breaking point. The Western values of freedom and individual rights weren't just outside the door. They were inside the hearts of the children. And for Mohammed Shafia, there was only one way to reclaim his honor. He didn't look for a way to understand his daughters. He looked for a way to erase the filth they had become. The golden cage was about to be replaced by a watery grave, and the people meant to protect them were already scouting the location. The plan for what Mohammed Shafia called a family vacation began to settle into its final, lethal shape in the sweltering heat of late June 2009. It was a 10-person caravan, a grand facade of domestic unity that stretched across hundreds of miles of highway. They traveled in 2 vehicles, the family's black Lexus SUV, the pride of Mohammed's fleet, and a recently purchased, second-hand silver Nissan Sentra. The Nissan had been bought just days before the trip, a detail that would later scream premeditation to investigators. To the outside world, it was just an extra car for a large family. In reality, it was a 4-wheeled coffin. They spent several days in Niagara Falls, acting out the roles of tourists. They took photos. They walked along the boardwalks. They marveled at the rushing water. But beneath the smiles captured in those photographs, a predatory observation was taking place. Mohammed and his eldest son, Hamed, weren't just looking at the falls. They were looking for an opportunity. They were scouring their mobile devices, searching for locations that combined 3 specific elements: deep water, a steep drop-off, and total, unmonitored isolation. The day X of this nightmare was June 30th, 2009. The temperature in Ontario was a stifling 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the air thick and heavy with humidity. As the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows over the landscape, the convoy began its return journey toward Montreal. But Mohammed didn't take the most direct route home. He detoured toward the historic city of Kingston, a place where the earth is scarred by the deep channels of the Rideau Canal. Around 1:30 a.m., the vehicles pulled into the parking lot of the Kingston Motel. The city was asleep, the streets deserted. Mohammed checked the family in, but the arrangement was bizarre for a man of his immense wealth. He rented only 2 small, cramped rooms for 10 people. While the younger children were ushered inside to sleep, a different energy was vibrating between the 3 conspirators. Mohammed, Tuba, and Hamed remained active, their voices low, their movements hurried. They weren't resting for the drive. They were moving into the final phase of their cleansing. Shortly before 2 a.m., the silver Nissan Sentra and the black Lexus pulled out of the motel parking lot, leaving the younger children behind. They headed toward the Kingston Mills Locks, a remote historic site where the canal meets a treacherous drop. The site was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating darkness. There were no streetlights here, only the rhythmic sound of rushing water and the rustle of the trees in the humid breeze. Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona were in the Nissan. They were likely exhausted, their defenses lowered by the long hours on the road. They had been told they were stopping for a break or to look at the locks, but they were actually being positioned. Zainab sat in the driver's seat. Sahar and Geeti were in the back. Rona, the woman who had lived a life of hell in Mohammed's shadow, sat beside Zainab. The car was positioned at the very edge of the concrete pier, its nose facing the deep, murky basin of the canal. Forensic reconstruction would later paint a chilling picture of what happened in those final seconds. The Nissan was idling at the lip of the water, but it didn't just roll over. To ensure it went into the deep channel and didn't snag on the edge, it needed a massive, mechanical push. Hamed took the wheel of the heavy Lexus SUV. He backed the vehicle up, lining it up with the smaller car like a professional executioner. He accelerated. The sound of the Lexus engine roared through the silent woods. The heavy SUV slammed into the rear of the Nissan Sentra with calculated force. The victims inside likely had only a split second of realization, a terrifying jolt of impact before the car was shoved forward. The Nissan's back bumper crumpled, and the car teetered for a heartbeat on the precipice before it tipped. It plunged nose first into the black water of the canal. As it hit the surface, the weight of the engine caused it to flip, the vehicle settling upside down on the silty bottom, 15 feet below the surface. Inside the cabin, the darkness was absolute. The windows were rolled up, the doors were locked, and as the cold water rushed in through the vents and gaps, there was no escape. They were trapped in a pitch-black, watery tomb. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass from the inside. It is believed they were either unconscious from the impact or simply overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of the canal. In the silence of the Kingston night, 4 lives were extinguished in minutes. But the conspirators had been clumsy. The collision had shattered the Lexus's headlight and grille, leaving small, jagged fragments of black plastic scattered across the concrete pier like dark, accusatory confetti. Hamed and Mohammed, in their haste to leave the scene of the cleansing, missed them. They drove the damaged Lexus back to the motel, its front end mangled from the honor they had just upheld. By 7 a.m. the next morning, Mohammed Shafia walked into the Kingston police station. He wore a practiced look of confusion and frustration. He told the officers that his daughters and his cousin had taken the Nissan for a joyride and hadn't returned. He claimed they were rebellious and likely got lost. As he spoke, he was already weaving the narrative of a tragic accident. unaware that the Rideau Canal was about to give up its dead, and that the fragments left on the pier would tell the truth he tried so hard to submerge. The sun rose over the historic skyline of Kingston on June 30th, 2009, with a deceptive, golden calm that masked the horror resting just below the surface of the Rideau Canal. At approximately 7 a.m., Mohammed Shafia walked into the Kingston police station with a practiced expression of frustration and bewilderment. He was a man playing a role, the weary patriarch of a large family whose rebellious children had finally pushed things too far. He reported that his 3 daughters, Zainab, Sahar, and Geeti, along with his cousin Rona, had taken the silver Nissan Sentra while the rest of the family slept and had not returned. He spun a tale of a joyride gone wrong, suggesting that the girls, infatuated with their newfound Western freedoms, had likely gotten lost or were hiding out of spite. While Mohammed was crafting his narrative for the officers, the Rideau Canal was beginning to reveal its secrets. A worker at the Kingston Mills locks noticed a strange shimmering on the water's surface, a rainbow of oil and gasoline that didn't belong in the pristine channel. Peering through the murky green depths, he spotted a metallic glint, the dull silver roof of a car resting upside down on the canal bed. He immediately called for emergency services, unaware that he had just uncovered a watery tomb. When the police and rescue divers arrived, the atmosphere at the locks was one of grim anticipation. Divers entered the stagnant cold water and confirmed that a vehicle was indeed submerged, its cabin filled with the silt and darkness of the canal. As the heavy tow truck slowly hoisted the silver Nissan from the depths, the weight of the tragedy became physical. Water cascaded from the shattered frame, and the stench of canal mud filled the air. Through the glass, the rescuers saw a sight that would haunt them for years: the silhouettes of 4 women huddled together as if for warmth in their final, terrifying moments. Zainab was in the driver's seat. Sahar and Geeti were in the back. Rona, the woman who had spent decades as a secret wife and domestic servant, sat beside the eldest daughter. They looked as if they were sleeping, their faces pale and serene in the morning light, but the autopsy would later confirm a more violent reality. They had been strangled before the car was dumped, or they had drowned in a pitch-black, locked cabin from which there was no escape. Mohammed and his second wife, Tuba, were brought to the scene, and their reaction was noted by every officer present. There was no wailing, no collapse of grief, no frantic demands for justice. Tuba looked away with a chilling detachment. Mohammed looked at the car, the vehicle that now held his 3 dead children, with a calculated expression of annoyance, as if his property had been damaged by their carelessness. But the search was just beginning. The investigators weren't looking at a simple drowning. They were looking at a crime scene. On the concrete pier, just feet from where the car had plunged into the basin, they found the fragments. Small, jagged pieces of black plastic lay scattered on the ground. When they turned their attention to the Shafia family's black Lexus SUV, the accident theory dissolved into a murder investigation. The Lexus had fresh damage to its front end, and the plastic fragments from the pier fit into the SUV's broken headlight assembly with 100% forensic certainty. The search for the missing women had ended in a morgue, but the hunt for the truth was now a high-stakes investigation into a conspiracy of honor. Detectives began to dig into the family's history, the calls to women's shelters, the reports of physical abuse, and the secret diary of a wife who knew she was living with her executioners. The canal had given up the bodies, and now the forensic evidence was about to give up the killers who thought they could submerge their shame forever. As the 4 bodies were transported to the morgue, the Kingston Police Department began the painstaking task of dismantling the Shafia family's elaborate facade of a tragic accident. Detective Sergeant Chris Scott and his team knew that in cases this calculated, the devil is in the details, the microscopic evidence and the digital footprints that the perpetrators think they've erased. The initial forensic examination of the silver Nissan Sentra provided the first major breakthrough. The damage to the rear bumper was not caused by hitting the water. It was a crushing, mechanical impact, the kind made by a heavy vehicle pushing a smaller one from behind with lethal intent. When investigators inspected the family's black Lexus SUV, the evidence became insurmountable. The damage on the SUV's front end was a perfect mirror to the damage on the Nissan's rear. The plastic fragments recovered from the pier at the Kingston Mills locks weren't just similar. They were a forensic match to the Lexus's grille and headlight assembly. This meant the Lexus hadn't just been nearby. It had been the physical engine of the crime, used to shove the girls and Rona over the precipice and into the abyss. But proving a conspiracy for murder, especially one masked as an honor killing, required understanding the psychological landscape of the Shafia home. Detectives initiated a series of interrogations, bringing in Mohammed, Tuba, and their eldest son, Hamed, separately. While Mohammed played the role of the grieving, traditional father for the cameras, his words in the privacy of the interrogation room and over the wiretaps told a much darker story. In recordings captured after the murders, Mohammed's voice was filled with a simmering, self-righteous rage. He was caught on tape referring to his own dead daughters as prostitutes and filth who had brought a terminal shame upon his name. He didn't speak of them with the hollow ache of loss. He spoke of them as property that had been successfully discarded. He was recorded telling Hamed, "May the devil shit on their graves," and insisting that even if he had to do it 100 times, he would clean his house of their westernized rebellion. The digital investigation, led by specialists in data recovery, provided the smoking gun of premeditation. On a computer used by Hamed, technicians found a history of searches that served as a blueprint for the execution. Weeks before the family vacation to Niagara Falls, someone had searched for "where to drown a car in Ontario" and "is it possible to commit a murder and not get caught?" They had even used Google Maps to zoom in on the remote Kingston Mills locks, scouting the exact spot where the concrete met the deep channel of the canal. The investigators also looked into the cellular data. On the night of June 30th, the family claimed they were all asleep in their motel rooms. But GPS pings and tower data told a different story. The phones belonging to Mohammed and Hamed were active at the locks at 2 a.m., the precise moment the Nissan was pushed into the water. As detectives reached out to the girls' schools and social services in Montreal, the full tragedy of missed opportunities came to light. Sahar had been seen with bruises. Gidi had begged her teachers to be placed in foster care, crying that her family was going to kill her. Zainab had spent weeks in a women's shelter, fleeing the prison of her home. The system had noted these red flags, but Mohammed's wealth and his ability to manipulate the narrative of cultural tradition had allowed him to keep his victims within reach. Perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence was the diary of Rona Amir Mohammed, the secret first wife. In its pages, she described a life of hell, characterized by systematic physical and verbal abuse from both Mohammed and Tuba. She knew she was in danger. She had become the girl's only protector, and in the end, she was deemed just as disposable as the daughters she tried to shield. By the end of July 2009, the weight of the fragments, the digital footprints, and the wiretapped confessions led to the arrest of the father, the mother, and the son. The investigation had revealed that in the Shafia house, honor was just another word for murder. The Crown's case was anchored by a mountain of forensic and digital evidence that left no room for doubt. Collision reconstruction experts testified with clinical, devastating precision, explaining that the silver Nissan Sentra didn't simply roll into the basin due to a driver's error. The damage to the rear bumper was a clear signature of a heavy, low-speed push from a much larger, more powerful vehicle, specifically the family's black Lexus SUV. This was supported by the discovery of matching plastic fragments at the canal pier, which fit into the Lexus's broken headlight assembly like pieces of a macabre jigsaw puzzle. The physical evidence told a story of a predatory hunt. one car forcing another toward the lip of a dark, 15-foot drop. But the most devastating evidence wasn't found in car parts or tire tracks. It was found in the voices of the accused. The jury was forced to listen to hours of wiretap recordings captured by the Kingston police in the weeks following the murders. In these recordings, Mohammed Shafia's voice was filled not with the hollow ache of a grieving father, but with a terrifying, self-righteous rage that chilled everyone in the gallery. He was heard calling his deceased daughters filth, traitors, and prostitutes. He told his son, "May the devil shit on their graves." For Mohammed, the deaths were a necessary act of cleansing to restore the family's honor. He spoke of the murders as a religious and cultural obligation, stating that even if they were to bring the girls back to life 100 times, he would do it all over again. Because to him, they were no longer his children. They were stains on his reputation. Tuba Yahya's testimony provided a different kind of horror. On the stand, she was a woman of constant contradictions, at times weeping and playing the role of the victim, at others offering cold, inconsistent explanations for the events of June 30. The prosecution systematically exposed her lies, highlighting how her story changed every time she was presented with a new piece of forensic evidence. She claimed she didn't know how the car ended up in the water, but the digital evidence showed her cell phone was active and pinging near the locks during the exact window of the drowning. She had stood by while her daughters were pushed into the dark. The defense attempted to frame the case as a tragic accident, arguing that Zainab had been behind the wheel and had accidentally driven over the edge during a late-night joyride. They claimed the damage to the Lexus happened elsewhere, and that the wiretapped rants were merely the expressions of a frustrated, traditional father, not a confession of murder. But the jury didn't buy it. The digital footprint was too clear. The premeditated searches for where to drown a car and the Google Maps tracking of the Kingston Mills locks weeks before the vacation began were the final nails in the coffin. On January 29, 2012, the jury reached their decision. The air in the courtroom was electric as the foreman stood up. Guilty. The word was repeated 12 times, 4 counts of first-degree murder for each of the 3 defendants. Mohammed and Hamed sat stone-faced, while Tuba began to wail, though many in the gallery noted the lack of actual tears. Judge Robert Moranger, in his final sentencing remarks, delivered a blistering condemnation that echoed across the country. He looked directly at the 3 killers and said, "It is difficult to conceive of a more despicable, more heinous, more honorless crime. The apparent reason for these cold-blooded, shameful murders was that the 4 innocent victims offended your twisted notion of honor that has no place in any civilized society. They were sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Even as they were led away, Mohammed Shafia remained defiant, shouting in the courtroom that he was a victim of a conspiracy and that the trial was an insult to his faith. He had sacrificed his family for a legacy that was now defined only by his own cruelty. The Rideau Canal remains a place of quiet, historic beauty, a ribbon of water that winds through the heart of Ontario, mirroring the changing seasons and the passage of time. But for those who know the story of the silver Nissan Sentra, the water will always hold a chill that has nothing to do with the winter frost. The case of the Shafia family didn't just end with a gavel hitting a block in a Kingston courtroom. It sent shockwaves through the collective consciousness of a nation, forcing a painful reckoning with the shadows that can hide behind the facade of a perfect immigrant success story. Zainab, Sahar, and Geeti were not just names on a police report, and they certainly weren't the stains their father described. They were vibrant, living dreams of a better life. Girls who were willing to trade their comfort and their safety for the simple human right to breathe a little more freely. They wanted to wear the clothes they chose, to love the people they wanted, and to study for a future they owned. They were teenagers who sought to bridge 2 worlds, only to be crushed by the narrow, violent gate of their father's pride. And Rona, the woman whose life was spent in a silent, systematic life of hell, became the ultimate symbol of the cost of that silence. She was the girl's only protector, and she died as she lived, trying to hold back a storm she didn't create. In the years since the trial, the sprawling house in Montreal was emptied of its tension and its terror. The marble floors no longer echo with Mohammed's rants, and the walls no longer bear witness to the fear of 3 young girls. The 3 remaining children, the survivors of this patriarchal war, were taken into the care of the state, their names changed and their identities hidden to protect them from the toxic legacy of their own kin. They are the living ghosts of a dynasty that was built on mercantile success but collapsed under the weight of a monstrous ego. Mohammed Shafia sought to preserve his honor by erasing his daughters, but in his pursuit of purity, he achieved the exact opposite. He didn't cleanse his name. He stained it with an indelible mark of cowardice. His name is now a footnote in the history of Canadian crime, a warning about the lethality of a pride that views human beings as property. The daughters he called filth are the ones now remembered with dignity and light, while he, Tuba, and Hamid rot in separate cells, their honor a hollow echo in a cramped prison. We are left with the image of the Kingston Mills locks, the stillness of the water, the rustle of the trees, and the memory of 4 women who simply wanted to choose their own paths. True honor isn't found in blood, reputation, or the control of others. It is found in the freedom to live, the right to love, and the strength to protect those who trust us. The Shafia sisters deserved a life as wide and as deep as the country they called home. Instead, they were given the bottom of a canal. But the water didn't hide them. It brought them home, and it brought the truth to light. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. A photograph is a fragment of a second, frozen in time. It captures a smile, a hug, a moment of joy. But what if that image is a lie? What if the light we see on our screens is merely a shadow cast by a deep, devouring darkness? We live in an era where reality is curated, and the truth is often buried beneath a mountain of likes and shares. This is the story of the Hart family, a family that appeared to be the pinnacle of progressive modern love, until the world watched them vanish into the Pacific mist. It is a story where the pursuit of a perfect digital persona eventually led to a horrific 100-foot plunge into the abyss. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the tragedy that unfolded on a lonely stretch of the California coast, we must first look back at the 2 women who stood at the center of it all. Jennifer Jean Hart and Sarah Margaret Gengler were both born in 1979, coming of age in the quiet, expansive landscapes of South Dakota. They were 2 young women who felt they were destined for something greater than the small-town life they were born into. They met while attending Northern State University, and for those who saw them together, the connection was immediate. They weren't just a couple, they were a unit. 2 people who shared a fierce, almost evangelical desire to leave a mark on the world. By the mid-2000s, Jennifer and Sarah had settled into a life that mirrored the ideals they championed. Jennifer, or Jen as everyone called her, was the charismatic leader. She was tall, with a voice that commanded attention and a presence that seemed to radiate positive energy. Sarah was the quiet anchor, the one who worked steady jobs, including a long tenure at a Kohl's department store, to provide the financial stability the family required. Together, they made a decision that would change the course of 8 lives. They decided to become mothers, but they didn't want just any family. They wanted to save children who had been discarded by the system. In 2006, while living in Alexandria, Minnesota, the couple adopted their first set of siblings from Texas, Marcus, Hannah, and Abigail. These were children who had come from a background of neglect, and the Harts presented themselves as the ultimate saviors. To the outside world, it was a beautiful act of compassion. Then, in 2009, they expanded their family again, adopting another sibling group of 3 from Texas: Devontae, Jeremiah, and Sierra. Now they were a family of 8, 2 white mothers and 6 black children. It was a visual statement that Jen Hart leaned into with every fiber of her being. The Harts were the Earth Moms. They were the family you would see at a Wandering Sage festival or a Bernie Sanders rally, decked out in tie-dye dreadlocks and colorful headbands. Jen's Facebook page was a meticulously curated gallery of this life. There were photos of the children posing in sun-drenched fields, pictures of organic home-cooked meals, and long poetic captions about choosing love and living authentically. Jen was a master of the digital narrative. She didn't just post updates. She told a story of a tribe that had overcome the trauma of their past through the power of her and Sarah's unconditional love. But as the likes piled up, the reality inside the Hart household was beginning to fray, and the first cracks appeared long before the final tragedy. The children, despite the smiling photos, were rarely seen by neighbors. When they were, they appeared smaller than they should have been for their ages. They were described as waif-like, with a strange, haunting stillness about them. In 2011, while still in Minnesota, the darkness behind the curtain was briefly exposed. 6-year-old Abigail told a teacher that she had owies on her tummy and back. When the school investigated, they found bruises. Sarah Hart eventually pleaded guilty to domestic assault and was sentenced to a year of probation. She told investigators that things had gotten out of hand while she was disciplining the child in the bathroom. Rather than addressing the underlying issues, the Harts did what they would do many times over the following decade. They moved. They left Minnesota for West Lynn, Oregon, an affluent suburb where they could blend into the liberal landscape. Here, Jen decided to pull the children out of public school. She claimed she was unschooling them, a philosophy that allowed children to follow their own interests. In reality, it was a way to isolate them. The children were now under Jen's control 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were no longer students. They were props in her grand production. The most famous of these props was Devontae Hart. In 2014, a photograph of Devontae went viral, capturing the hearts of millions. It showed the young boy, tears streaming down his face, hugging a white police officer during a protest in Portland. He was wearing a sign that said, "Free hugs." To the world, Devontae was a symbol of hope and racial reconciliation. To Jennifer Hart, he was a celebrity who brought her the validation she craved. But behind that viral hug was a boy who, according to later reports, was so hungry he was begging neighbors for food. In 2017, the family moved once more, this time to a large, secluded home in Woodland, Washington. The house sat on 2 acres, hidden from the road by a long driveway and thick trees. It was the perfect place for a family that wanted to be left alone, and the perfect place for a house of horrors to remain hidden. Neighbors in Woodland would later recount how they almost never saw the children outside playing. There were no toys in the yard, no bicycles, no laughter. The only thing they saw was Jennifer, sitting on her porch, staring out into the distance, and the children, occasionally lined up like soldiers to help with chores. As the family entered 2018, the walls were closing in. The children were becoming teenagers, and their smallness, which Jen had always attributed to their biological backgrounds, was becoming impossible to ignore. Hannah, then 16, was so emaciated she looked like she was barely 10 years old. Devontae, the face of the family, was 15 but weighed only 100 pounds. They were living in a beautiful house in a beautiful neighborhood, surrounded by the love their mothers preached. But they were starving in the shadows of their own home. The digital world saw a family of light and love, but the neighbors saw something very different. On a cold morning in March 2018, the DeKalb family, who lived next door, were startled by a knock at their door. Standing there was Devontae. He didn't look like the boy from the free hugs photo. He looked terrified. He told the DeKalbs that his mothers were punishing them by withholding food. He begged them to leave a bag of crackers by the fence for him and his siblings. He told them his mothers were mean and that he was scared. This wasn't just a cry for help. It was the beginning of the end. The DeKalbs eventually contacted Child Protective Services, CPS. On Friday, March 23, 2018, a CPS worker pulled up the long driveway in Woodland and knocked on the Hart's door. No one answered. But inside, Jennifer and Sarah Hart knew the truth was finally catching up to them. The mask was slipping, and for Jennifer Hart, a life without her curated perfection was a life not worth living. The story of Jennifer and Sarah didn't begin with a bang. It began with a shared sense of displacement. In the late 90s, the campus of Northern State University in Aberdeen, South Dakota, was a world of vast prairies and traditional values. For two young women exploring their identities, it must have felt like a beautiful, isolated cage. Jennifer Hart and Sarah Gengler found in each other a mirror, a reflection of the people they wanted to become. They weren't just a couple, they were an alliance. Their bond was forged in a mutual desire to reject the norm of their upbringing and build something revolutionary, something that the world would have to stop and notice. By 2004, the two had moved to Alexandria, Minnesota. This was the honeymoon phase of their life together, a time of exploration and grand plans. Jennifer was the creative engine, the one who painted their future in vibrant, impossible colors. Sarah was the worker, the silent provider who allowed Jennifer's dreams to take flight. They bought a modest home, they joined local community groups, and they began to craft the image of the perfect progressive couple. But there was a restlessness in Jennifer. A house and a partner weren't enough to satisfy the hunger she felt for validation. She needed a larger stage. She needed a legacy. In 2006, that legacy began to take shape. The couple decided to adopt. They didn't just want one child. They wanted to provide a forever home for children who had seen the worst of the system. They went to Texas, where they were matched with 3 siblings, Marcus, Hannah, and Abigail. To the caseworkers, Jennifer and Sarah were a godsend. They were educated, stable, and seemingly overflowing with love. When the girls and their brother arrived in Minnesota, Jennifer's Facebook page, which was then in its infancy, erupted with joy. She spoke of healing souls and building a tribe. For a while, the world believed her. Friends in Alexandria saw the Harts at local parks, the children dressed in matching outfits, their hair neatly braided. Jennifer would talk for hours about their progress, how they were learning to trust again, how love was the only language spoken in their home. But behind the closed doors of that Minnesota house, a different language was being drafted, a language of control. The first red flag wasn't a scream. It was a whisper. In 2008, just 2 years after the first adoptions, local authorities received a tip. A teacher noticed that 6-year-old Hannah was coming to school with bruises. When questioned, Jennifer had an answer for everything. She spoke of the children's troubled backgrounds, of their reactive attachment disorder, and how their previous trauma made them prone to self-harm or clumsy accidents. She was so convincing, so articulate, that the investigation was closed. Jennifer didn't see this as a warning. She saw it as a challenge to her narrative. In 2009, despite the quiet whispers of concern, the Harts were allowed to adopt again. Another sibling group from Texas, Devontae, Jeremiah, and Sierra. Now the Hart tribe was complete. 2 mothers, 6 children, all living under the banner of choosing love. Jennifer's social media presence became a full-time occupation. She wasn't just a mother, she was a brand. She posted photos of the kids holding signs with inspirational quotes. pictures of them at festivals, and long, winding essays about the beauty of their multicolored family. But the reality was beginning to rot from the inside out. In 2010, 6-year-old Abigail, the youngest of the first group, told a teacher that she was being hit. She said Jennifer had pushed her into a wall. This time, the state of Minnesota didn't look away. During the investigation, it was Sarah Hart who stepped forward to take the fall. She claimed that Jennifer was the loving one and that she, Sarah, had simply lost her cool during a disciplinary session in the bathroom. In 2011, Sarah pleaded guilty to domestic assault. This should have been the end. The system should have stepped in. But Jennifer Hart was a master of the pivot. She used the conviction to further isolate her family. She told her followers that they were being persecuted by a system that didn't understand their unconventional parenting. She claimed the state was biased against their lifestyle. And then she made the tactical decision that would seal the children's fate. She pulled them out of the public school system forever. Unschooling, Jennifer called it. She claimed the children were too sensitive for the harshness of the traditional classroom. She said they were learning from nature, from art, from the rhythm of life. In truth, she was removing the last set of eyes that could see the bruises. She was cutting the children off from the only people who might have saved them. The family moved to West Lynn, Oregon, a suburb of Portland that prided itself on its weirdness and its tolerance. Here, the Harts became local celebrities in the progressive scene. They were the family you saw at the farmer's market, the ones who always seemed to be in a state of bliss. Jennifer's Facebook posts became even more frequent, even more poetic. She spoke of the children as enlightened beings who didn't need the constraints of society. But neighbors in West Lynn began to notice things that didn't fit the Facebook captions. They saw the children standing in the yard for hours, perfectly still, like statues. They noticed that the kids never seemed to grow. Hannah, who was a teenager, looked like a small child. They were thin, painfully thin. When neighbors offered the children food, Jennifer would intervene, claiming they had severe food allergies or eating disorders stemming from their past neglect. The honeymoon was over, and the power struggle that Stephen Grant had felt in his own marriage, that same need for absolute control, was manifesting in Jennifer in a much more psychological way. She didn't just want to be the breadwinner, she wanted to be the god of her own small world. The most chilling example of this control was the 2014 Free Hugs photo of Devontae. To the world, it was a moment of pure, raw emotion. Devontae, a black boy, hugging a white police officer during the Ferguson protests in Portland. The photo went global. It was featured on news outlets from New York to London. Jennifer basked in the glory. She wrote that Devontae had felt the need to spread love in a world of hate. But while the world saw a boy who loved, the people who lived near the Harts saw a boy who was starving. Shortly after that photo went viral, Devontae began sneaking out of the house. He would go to the neighbors, begging for food. Not just a snack. He wanted anything. Bread, crackers, leftovers. He told them he was hungry. He told them his mothers were punishing the family by not letting them eat for days at a time. The neighbors in Oregon eventually called the authorities. But again, Jennifer Hart worked her magic. She told the investigators that Devontae was manipulative, a trait she blamed on his biological mother. She said he was obsessed with food because of his early childhood trauma and that they were actually on a strict, healthy diet to help him heal. Once again, the case was closed. Jennifer didn't see this as a close call. She saw it as proof that she was untouchable. In 2017, the pressure in Oregon became too much. The neighbors were watching. The authorities were asking questions. So, the Harts did what they always did when the truth got too close. They fled. They moved to Woodland, Washington, to a house hidden by trees at the end of a long gravel drive, a house where no one could see them. In this new home, the isolation was total. The Hart tribe was now a closed circuit. Sarah worked long hours at Kohl's, coming home to a house ruled by Jennifer's moods. The children were no longer children. They were workers in Jennifer's digital factory. They spent their days cleaning, posing for photos, and rehearsing the happiness that Jennifer required for her Facebook updates. But the hunger couldn't be rehearsed. The children were becoming desperate. Hannah, Jeremiah, Marcus. They were all reaching their late teens, yet none of them weighed more than 100 pounds. They were living in a constant state of caloric deprivation, a house of horrors wrapped in tie-dye and organic linens. The relationship between Jennifer and Sarah had shifted from a partnership to a cult of two. Sarah, who had once been the quiet provider, was now a co-conspirator in the slow destruction of 6 lives. She saw the ribs. She saw the sunken eyes. She saw the way the children flinched when Jennifer raised her voice. But she stayed. She kept working. She kept providing the money that allowed Jennifer to maintain the illusion. By early 2018, the mask was beginning to crumble. The digital persona that Jennifer had spent over a decade building was being threatened by the one thing she couldn't control: the children's will to survive. Devontae's knocks on the DeKalb family's door in March of 2018 weren't just a request for crackers. They were a death warrant for the perfect life Jennifer Hart had created. The CPS visit on March 23rd was the final straw. For Jennifer Hart, the thought of the world seeing the real Hannah, the 16-year-old who weighed 70 pounds, was worse than death. If she couldn't be the savior she had promised the world, then she wouldn't be anything at all, and she wouldn't let the children exist without her. The relationship that began on a college campus in South Dakota, fueled by a dream of authenticity, had turned into a suicide pact. A pact that included 6 innocent children who had already been failed by everyone who was supposed to protect them. The abyss wasn't just at the bottom of a cliff in California. It had been in their home for years. The clock began its final relentless countdown on Friday, March 23rd, 2018. It was a day that started like any other in the secluded, wood-shrouded house in Woodland, Washington, but the air inside that home was already heavy with a terminal kind of tension. The Hart children, Marcus, Hannah, Abigail, Devontae, Jeremiah, and Sierra, were prisoners of a routine that had become a slow-motion nightmare. They were hungry, they were tired, and they were living under the absolute, suffocating shadow of Jennifer Hart's shifting moods. For years, the family had moved across state lines to outrun the truth. But on this Friday, the truth finally walked up the driveway and knocked on the front door. It was a representative from Child Protective Services. They were there because the neighbors, the DeKalbs, had finally seen past the tie-dye and the smiles. They had seen the terror in Devontae's eyes as he begged for bread. They had heard Hannah's desperate pleas in the middle of the night. As the officials stood on the porch, knocking, the house remained deathly silent. Inside, the Harts were huddled together, holding their breath. Jennifer and Sarah knew that if they opened that door, the game was over. They knew that a single glance at the children's skeletal frames would be enough to dismantle the entire digital empire Jen had spent 12 years constructing. The knock went unanswered. But for Jennifer, that sound was the tolling of a bell. The walls were finally, truly closing in. As soon as the CPS vehicle pulled away, the panic inside the house transitioned into a cold, mechanical efficiency. There would be no more unschooling lessons. There would be no more staged photo shoots in the yard. Jennifer and Sarah began to pack, but they weren't packing for a new life or another relocation. They were packing for a finality that only they understood. They loaded the family's 2003 GMC Yukon XL, a massive gold-colored SUV that had carried them through thousands of miles of performance and pretense. They didn't pack toys. They didn't pack school books. They packed the essentials for a long one-way journey. The flight from Woodland began under the cover of darkness. As the SUV turned off the gravel drive and onto the main road, heading south toward the Oregon border, the children likely believed this was just another sudden move. Another adventure to a new place where things might finally get better. They settled into the cramped rows of the Yukon, 6 children squeezed into a space that had become their mobile cage. The heater hummed against the March chill, and the Pacific Northwest landscape blurred into a series of dark, looming shadows outside the windows. Jennifer was behind the wheel, her grip on the steering wheel tight, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, perhaps staring at the glowing dashboard, already retreating into the pharmacological haze that would define her final hours. They drove through the night, crossing into Oregon. The 101 highway became their artery, a winding path that clung to the jagged edges of the coast. For the children, the passage of time must have been a blur of hunger and exhaustion. There were no stops at roadside diners. There were no happy meals. To the world watching through Jen's Facebook, they were the Hart tribe, a family of light. To the gas station attendants who saw them in the dead of night, they were a silent, ghost-like group. By Saturday morning, the Harts had reached the rugged beauty of Northern California. This was a landscape that Jennifer had always romanticized. The towering redwoods, the crashing surf, the feeling of being at the very edge of the world. But the beauty was lost on the 8 passengers of the Yukon. Jennifer's phone records would later reveal a chilling glimpse into her mental state during this drive. She wasn't looking for hotels. She wasn't looking for help. She was searching the internet for information on suicide, death by drowning, and how much Benadryl does it take to kill a child. The plan was no longer a frantic reaction. It was a calculated execution. On the morning of March 24th, the Yukon pulled into a Safeway grocery store in Fort Bragg, California. This is one of the last times the world would see Jennifer Hart alive. Security footage captured her walking through the aisles, a tall woman in a black jacket, her hair pulled back, moving with a purposeful, eerie calm. She bought groceries, fruit, chips, and a large quantity of Benadryl. She stood at the checkout counter, interacting with the clerk, appearing for all the world like a mother on a family road trip. But there were no children with her in the store. They remained in the car, hidden behind the tinted glass, waiting for a mother who was currently purchasing the tools of their destruction. As Saturday turned into Sunday, the Yukon began to linger. They weren't just driving anymore. They were searching for a location. They spent hours idling in turnouts along Highway 1 in Mendocino County. This stretch of road is legendary for its beauty and its danger. A narrow ribbon of asphalt perched hundreds of feet above the churning cold waters of the Pacific. It is a place of mist and salt spray where the land simply ends. Inside the SUV, the atmosphere had shifted into something truly horrific. Investigators would later find that Sarah Hart had a massive amount of diphenhydramine, Benadryl, in her system. The children, too, had been drugged. Jennifer had likely mixed the liquid medication into their drinks, perhaps telling them it was a special treat or something to help them sleep through the long drive. One by one, the children began to drift off. Their breathing slowed, their heads lolled against the headrests. The hunger that had defined their lives was finally being replaced by a heavy, chemical slumber. Marcus, who was 19 but weighed only 90 pounds. Hannah, who was 16 and so fragile. Abigail, Jeremiah, Sierra, and Devante. The boy whose smile had traveled across the globe was now unconscious in the back of a gold SUV, his fate being decided by the woman he had once called his hero. Jennifer Hart, however, remained awake. She was the pilot of this final mission. Her blood alcohol level was later measured at 0.102, above the legal limit, but not high enough to cause an accident. She was functional. She was aware. She spent those final hours sitting in the driver's seat, perhaps watching the waves crash against the rocks 100 feet below. She watched the sun set over the Pacific, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. She looked at Sarah, her partner of 20 years, who was now unresponsive beside her. She looked in the rearview mirror at the 6 children who were the only proof of her perfect life. If she let them live, the truth would come out. The world would see the starvation. They would see the bruises. They would see the unschooling for the fraud it was. The Jen Hart brand would be dismantled piece by piece on the nightly news. To Jennifer, the ego was more important than the lives she claimed to have saved. If the story couldn't have a happy ending, she would ensure it had no ending at all. She would simply erase the characters. Late Sunday night, or perhaps in the early gray hours of Monday morning, Jennifer Hart put the Yukon into gear. She was parked at a dirt turnout overlooking the ocean near Juan Creek. There were no skid marks found at the scene. This wasn't a moment of panic or a loss of control. It was a deliberate, steady acceleration. The heavy SUV moved forward, leaving the safety of the gravel. It traveled about 70 feet across the flat, grassy area of the turnout. Jennifer kept her foot on the gas. The speedometer climbed. 20 miles per hour, 30, 40. The Yukon reached the very edge of the cliff, a 100-foot drop into the jagged rocks and the surging tide. For a fraction of a second, the massive vehicle must have hung in the air, a gold speck against the vastness of the Pacific night. Then, gravity took hold. The impact was catastrophic. The Yukon hit the rocks below nose first before flipping onto its roof. The sound of the crash, the crushing of metal, the shattering of glass, was swallowed instantly by the roar of the ocean. There were no screams. The children were too heavily sedated to even know the end had come. Jennifer and Sarah were killed instantly as the roof of the vehicle collapsed under the weight of the fall. The Pacific Ocean, cold and indifferent, began to wash over the wreckage, pulling the secrets of the Hart family into its depths. When the sun rose on Monday, March 26th, the gold SUV was visible from the road above, resting upside down on the rocks. To the first responders who rappelled down the cliffside, it looked like a tragic accident. But as they began to recover the bodies, the two women in the front, the small, emaciated frames of the children in the back, a much darker picture began to emerge. They found the Benadryl. They found the lack of skid marks. And they found a family that had been fleeing a reality they could no longer contain. The day X of the Hart family didn't end with a rescue. It ended exactly where Jennifer Hart intended, in the silence of the abyss. She had managed to orchestrate one last horrific event that the world would be forced to watch. But this time, she couldn't control the narrative. This time, the likes wouldn't save her. The final 24 hours of the Harts were a journey from a house of hidden hunger to a cliffside of ultimate betrayal, a journey fueled by the desperate need to keep a lie alive, even if it meant extinguishing the lives of 6 innocent souls who had only ever wanted a place to belong. As the tide came in, the gold SUV was partially submerged, and the names of the children, Marcus, Hannah, Abigail, Jeremiah, and Sierra, became part of a recovery effort that would haunt the state of California for years. And Devontae, the boy from the photo, he was gone. His body was never found in the initial wreckage, leaving a lingering, ghostly question mark on the edge of the Pacific. A boy who had spent his life seeking a hug was now lost to the sea, a final victim of a love that was actually a death sentence. The morning of March 26, 2018, dawned with a heavy gray shroud over the Mendocino coast, a typical Northern California morning where the mist clings to the jagged rocks like a damp blanket. Highway 1, that winding, treacherous ribbon of asphalt, was quiet, save for the occasional roar of the surf 100 feet below. It was a passing motorist, pulling into a scenic turnout near Juan Creek, who first noticed that something was terribly wrong. Peering over the edge of the overlook, a place meant for photographs and awe, they saw a flash of gold against the dark, churning water. It was the underbelly of a car, a massive vehicle, resting upside down on the rocks, its wheels pointing toward the indifferent sky. When the first responders from the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office arrived, they faced a scene that was as logistically difficult as it was emotionally devastating. The cliff was a sheer drop, 100 feet of crumbling earth and sharp stone. They had to rappel down, their ropes swaying in the salt spray, toward a wreck that was being battered by the incoming tide. As they reached the gold GMC Yukon, the smell of gasoline and salt air filled their lungs. The vehicle was crushed, its roof flattened, its windows shattered into a million glinting diamonds. The recovery began in silence. Inside the front of the cabin, they found two women. Jennifer Hart was still behind the wheel, her body held in place by the twisted metal. Sarah Hart was in the passenger seat. Both were dead, their faces pale and fixed in the finality of the impact. But as the officers moved toward the rear of the vehicle, the tragedy took on a dimension that none of them were prepared for. Squeezed into the back, among the luggage and the debris of a life on the run, were the bodies of three children: Marcus, Jeremiah, and Abigail. They were so small. Even Marcus, who was 19 years old, looked like a young boy in the wreckage. Their bodies were recovered with a grim, practiced efficiency, hauled up the cliffside in baskets as the sun began to burn through the fog. But as the investigators began to run the registration of the vehicle and cross-reference the names of the deceased, a chilling realization took hold. The Hart family didn't have 3 children. They had 6. Where were Devontae, Hannah, and Sierra? Suddenly, what had looked like a tragic traffic accident transformed into a massive, multi-state disappearance investigation. The California Highway Patrol and the FBI were called in. They looked at the turnout, the place where the gold SUV had left the road. There were no skid marks, no signs of a sudden swerve to avoid a deer or a patches of ice, just a straight, determined path across 70 feet of dirt and grass, ending at the abyss. While search teams in California began to comb the shoreline, another team of investigators was racing toward the Hart's home in Woodland, Washington, nearly 500 miles to the north. They expected to find a house in disarray, perhaps a sign of a struggle, or maybe the 3 missing children waiting for their parents to return. Instead, they found a tomb. The house at the end of the long gravel drive was perfectly still. It was a beautiful, sprawling home, but as the police crossed the threshold, the perfect image began to dissolve. The house was clean, strangely clean. There were no toys on the floor, no colorful drawings on the refrigerator, no signs of the chaotic, vibrant life Jennifer Hart had described so vividly on Facebook. In the kitchen, they found a refrigerator stocked with organic food, but the house felt hollow, like a stage set after the actors had fled. The search of the property revealed something even more disturbing. In the trash, they found discarded items that suggested a frantic departure. But it was the testimonies of the neighbors, specifically the DeKalb family, that finally provided the context for the disappearance. The DeKalbs told the police about the knocks in the night. They told them about Hannah Hart, who had showed up at their door months earlier, missing 2 front teeth, begging them to hide her. They told them about Devontae, who had spent the weeks leading up to the crash begging for food, claiming his mothers were starving him as punishment. The perfect family was a lie, and the 3 missing children were now the subjects of a frantic, desperate search. Back in California, the search for Devontae, Hannah, and Sierra had become a battle against the elements. The Pacific Ocean in March is a violent, unpredictable force. The search teams used drones, helicopters, and side-scan sonar. They walked the beaches for miles, looking for any sign of a child's shoe or a piece of clothing. Divers attempted to enter the water near the crash site, but the surge, the powerful underwater movement of the tide, was too dangerous. They were searching for bodies in a place that didn't like to give them up. A week passed, then 2. The nation was captivated by the mystery. The free hugs photo of Devontae was everywhere again, but now it was a haunting reminder of a boy who had vanished into the mist. People held vigils. They left flowers at the top of the cliff in Mendocino, but the ocean remained silent. It wasn't until weeks later that the water began to yield its grim secrets. The body of a small girl was found floating near McCarricher State Park, several miles north of the crash site. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already feared. It was Sierra Hart. Not long after, another set of remains was discovered on a beach in Georgia Pacific, identified as Hannah. But Devontae, the face of the family, the boy the world felt they knew, was nowhere to be found. The search continued for months. Every piece of debris, every bone found on the Northern California coast was tested and retested. The investigators looked at the currents, they looked at the tides, they tried to map where the ocean might have carried a 15-year-old boy. But as the weeks turned into months, the search transitioned from a rescue to a recovery, and eventually to a cold case of the most heartbreaking kind. The disappearance of the Hart family wasn't just a physical vanishing, it was the vanishing of a myth. As the police delved into Jennifer's digital life, they found a woman who was obsessed with her image, even as she planned the end. They found Sarah's text messages, which spoke of a mounting, quiet desperation. The search for the family was over, but the search for the truth was only beginning. In the end, the gold SUV on the rocks was the only punctuation mark on a story that Jennifer Hart had tried to edit until the very last second. 5 of the children had been recovered from the surf, their bodies telling a story of starvation and sedation that their mothers had tried to hide. But Devontae remained a ghost, a final, lingering piece of a puzzle that refused to be completed. The search for the Hart family ended not with a resolution, but with a vast, empty horizon over the Pacific, a place where the truth had been driven off a cliff and buried in 100 feet of cold, dark water. The world watched as the divers packed their gear and the helicopters stopped their patrols. The Hart tribe was gone. The house in Woodland was sold. The Facebook page was eventually taken down. But for the investigators who stood on that cliffside in Mendocino, the search would never truly be over. They would always look at the gray water and wonder about the boy who wasn't there, the boy who had slipped through the fingers of the law, the system, and eventually the sea itself. As the gold GMC Yukon was winched up the side of that 100-foot cliff, dripping with seawater and tangled with kelp, the investigation moved from the shoreline into the sterile, unforgiving light of the laboratory and the digital forensic suite. This wasn't a search for a motive. The motive was written in every dent of that crushed metal. It was a search for the depth of a betrayal. The investigators in Mendocino County and the FBI began to peel back the layers of the Hart family, and what they found was a systemic, calculated erasure of 6 human beings. It was an investigation that would eventually reveal that the plunge into the abyss didn't happen in a single second on a Monday morning. It had been happening for years, one withheld meal at a time. The first and perhaps most damning piece of evidence came from the toxicology reports. In a case involving a massive vehicle traveling at high speed off a cliff, you expect to find signs of a mechanical failure or a sudden medical emergency. You look for skid marks, for the smell of burnt rubber, for any indication that the driver tried to stop. But there was nothing. The investigation confirmed that the Yukon had been at a full stop at a dirt turnout before Jennifer Hart pinned the accelerator. There was no braking. There was no steering away. When the blood work came back for the occupants, the accident narrative disintegrated entirely. Sarah Hart, the quiet provider, had a staggering amount of diphenhydramine, Benadryl, in her system. She wasn't just sleepy, she was incapacitated. She was a passenger in the truest, most tragic sense of the word. And the children? Marcus, Jeremiah, Abigail, Sierra, and Hannah. They too were saturated with the drug. The investigation revealed that Jennifer had essentially turned the SUV into a rolling sedative chamber. These children, who had spent their lives being told they were part of a tribe of love, were drugged into a chemical stupor so they wouldn't, or couldn't, scream as their mother drove them toward the edge of the world. Jennifer Hart, however, was the only one who remained functional. Her toxicology showed a blood alcohol level of 0.102. In the eyes of the law, She was intoxicated, but in the eyes of the forensic psychologists, she was just drunk enough to follow through with the plan. She hadn't passed out. She hadn't lost motor control. She had made a conscious, sober-minded decision to murder her family. The digital investigation proved to be even more chilling. Detectives seized the computers and phones from the Woodland house, and what they found was a woman who was methodically researching her own exit strategy. Jennifer's search history in the days leading up to the crash was a roadmap to a massacre. She hadn't been looking for a new home or a way to fight the CPS allegations. She was Googling, how much Benadryl for a 100-pound child? Is death by drowning painful? Can you survive a 100-foot fall into water? She was cold. She was clinical. She was a director scouting the final scene of her own movie. But the investigation had to look beyond the toxicology to answer the why. They turned to the children's bodies, the silent witnesses. The autopsies of the recovered children told a story that Jennifer's Facebook page had spent a decade suppressing. These were teenagers who should have been growing, flourishing, and entering adulthood. Instead, the medical examiner found that their bodies were in a state of chronic, severe malnutrition. Marcus was 19 years old, but he had the bone density and weight of a much younger child. Their stomachs were empty. Their growth was stunted. The investigation concluded that the Hart children hadn't just been disciplined. They had been starved. This led the investigators back to the neighbors. The testimony of the DeKalb family became the emotional core of the case. They recounted how the Hart children would wait until Jennifer was occupied or out of the house to run across the property line. They described Hannah showing up in the middle of the night, her hair matted, her teeth missing, whispering that her mothers were mean and that she was not allowed to eat. They described Devante, the boy the world saw as a symbol of racial healing, standing in their kitchen, shaking as he ate a stolen piece of fruit, terrified that Jennifer would find out. The investigation into the free hugs photo was perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation of all. To the millions who shared that image, it was a moment of hope. To the investigators, it was a moment of exploitation. They discovered that Jennifer had orchestrated the entire protest trip to Portland. She had put the sign in Devante's hands. She had positioned him. And when the photo went viral, she used the fame to shield herself from further scrutiny. The more famous the Harts became, the more the authorities were hesitant to investigate them. They were a model family, and Jennifer knew exactly how to use that as a weapon. As the forensic audit of the Woodland house continued, investigators found that the isolation was absolute. There were no signs of unschooling materials, no books, no art supplies, no traces of the intellectual curiosity Jennifer claimed to foster. The children didn't have friends. They didn't have outside contacts. They were a closed system, a cult of personality where Jennifer was the high priestess and Sarah was the enforcer. The investigation revealed a pattern of punishment cycles, periods where the children were forbidden from speaking, forbidden from looking each other in the eye, and, most cruelly, forbidden from eating. The investigation also touched on the failure of the system. Detectives tracked the family's movements from Minnesota to Oregon to Washington. They found that every time a report was filed, every time a teacher or a neighbor noticed a bruise or a skeletal frame, the Harts would simply pack up and move. They exploited the lack of communication between state agencies. They jurisdiction hopped to stay one step ahead of the truth. Jennifer used her status as a white, middle-class, progressive mother to deflect suspicion. She was articulate, she was enlightened, and she knew exactly how to speak the language of social workers to make them feel that they were the ones being unreasonable. Even the vehicle itself provided evidence. The GMC Yukon XL was a heavy, stable machine. It took a significant amount of force and a sustained press of the pedal to drive it across 70 feet of rough terrain and off that ledge. There was no mechanical failure found in the steering column or the brakes. The investigation concluded that the car did exactly what Jennifer Hart commanded it to do. It was a 6,000-pound murder weapon. In the final months of the investigation, as the search for Devontae's remains continued fruitlessly, the authorities were forced to confront a haunting reality. Jennifer Hart hadn't just killed her children to escape the law. She had killed them because she couldn't stand the thought of them existing without her narrative. She didn't want them to go into foster care and tell the truth. She didn't want the likes to turn into comments of horror. To Jennifer, the children weren't people. They were extensions of her own ego. If she was going to be deleted, they had to be deleted too. The investigation closed with a grim certainty. There were no unanswered questions regarding the cause of the crash. It was a mass murder-suicide, meticulously planned and executed by a woman who chose her own digital reputation over the lives of 6 children. The investigation block of this story doesn't end with a smoking gun. It ends with a mountain of evidence showing that for the Hart children, the world was a place of hunger and pretense, and the only person who was supposed to save them was the one who eventually led them into the sea. As the case files were boxed away, the investigators were left with the images of the woodland house, a place that looked like a home but functioned like a prison. They were left with the toxicology reports that showed a family drugged into silence, and they were left with the realization that in the age of social media, the most dangerous place to be isn't in a dark alley. It's behind a perfect filter, where the screams are drowned out by the sound of 1,000 likes. The legal resolution of the Hart family tragedy was not a trial in the traditional sense, for there were no living defendants to stand before a jury. Instead, the truth was excavated through a rare and somber legal proceeding known as a coroner's inquest, held in Willits, California, in early 2019. For 2 days, a 14-member jury listened to the mechanical and biological evidence that dismantled the perfect facade Jennifer Hart had so carefully maintained. The goal was to officially determine the manner of death for the 8 individuals who perished beneath the Mendocino cliffs. What emerged was a reconstruction of a crime so calculated that it left the courtroom in a state of stunned, heavy silence. The jury was presented with the chilling reality that this was a mass murder-suicide. The evidence was irrefutable. Jennifer Hart had intentionally steered the 2003 GMC Yukon XL off the 100-foot precipice. Investigators testified that there were no mechanical defects in the vehicle and, most tellingly, no evidence of braking at the scene. The jury heard how the SUV had accelerated from a stopped position, traveling across 70 feet of terrain with a heavy foot on the pedal until it cleared the edge. The manner of death for the 6 children was officially ruled as homicide at the hands of another, while Jennifer and Sarah's deaths were ruled as suicides. The inquest also served as a final public accounting of the victims. The names of the children, Marcus, Hannah, Abigail, Jeremiah, and Sierra, were read into the record alongside the brutal findings of their autopsies. The medical examiner testified to the staggering levels of Benadryl found in their systems, explaining that the children were likely unconscious or in a deep stupor when the vehicle hit the rocks. This chemical immobilization ensured there would be no struggle, no escape, and no survivors. The children who had spent their lives silenced by fear were, in their final moments, silenced by pharmacology. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the legal proceedings was the status of 15-year-old Devontae Hart. While the bodies of his 5 siblings had been recovered from the churning Pacific surf over the course of several weeks, Devontae remained missing. His death was legally presumed based on the circumstances of the crash, but the boy whose tear-streaked face had once represented a plea for racial harmony had been swallowed by the sea. In April 2019, a judge officially signed his death certificate, a paper-thin conclusion to a life that had been lived in the glare of a camera lens and the shadows of a starving home. The investigation and subsequent inquest also cast a harsh light on the systemic failure that allowed the Harts to continue their reign of terror. The jury heard how the family had moved across 3 different states, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington, to evade authorities. Every time a report of abuse or starvation surfaced, the Harts would simply jurisdiction hop, exploiting the lack of communication between state child welfare agencies. Jennifer's ability to manipulate social workers by using her progressive identity as a shield was noted as a primary reason why the children were never permanently removed from the home. While there were no prison sentences to be handed down, the trial of the Hart family in the court of public opinion was devastating. The revelation that the children were subjected to punishment cycles that included withholding food and forced silence for days on end shattered the myth of the Hart tribe. The digital evidence showed that Jennifer had been searching for suicide methods even as she was posting photos of the children smiling. It was a case where the sentencing was rendered not by a judge, but by the cold, hard facts of the children's physical condition, bodies that bore the marks of a decade of neglect. In the end, the legal resolution provided a grim closure. The case was officially closed, the death certificates were filed, and the House of Horrors in Woodland was eventually cleared of its remaining artifacts. But for the community of Mendocino and the neighbors who had tried to save the children, the sentence was a lifelong burden of what if. The inquest proved that the Harts didn't just fall off a cliff. They were driven there by a woman who would rather see her children dead than see her reputation destroyed. The trial of the Hart family ended with a final, official acknowledgement. They were victims of a mother who loved her image more than she loved their lives. The story of the Hart family remains one of the most chilling chapters in the annals of modern crime, serving as a stark, haunting reminder that the digital world we inhabit is often nothing more than a hall of mirrors. We look at the photos, we read the poetic captions about choosing love, and we desperately want to believe that beauty is truth. But for Marcus, Hannah, Abigail, Devante, Jeremiah, and Sierra, the light their mothers preached was a blinding glare used to hide a world of hunger, isolation, and terror. They were children who were saved from the foster system only to be sacrificed on the altar of a woman's insatiable ego. Jennifer Hart drove her family into the Pacific not because she was a mother in pain, but because she was a performer who refused to let the curtain fall on her lies. Today, the cliff in Mendocino stands as a silent, jagged monument to those 6 stolen lives, a place where the eternal roar of the ocean forever drowns out the hollow, empty sound of 1,000 likes. In the end, the only thing that was truly authentic about the Hart family was the tragedy they left behind in the cold salt spray and the dark, indifferent deep. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. What is the price of silence? We often tell ourselves that monsters are outsiders, drifters hiding in the woods, or shadows lurking in dark alleys. We want to believe that evil is something that must break into our world from the outside. But the most terrifying truth of the human condition is that, sometimes, the darkness is born right within the walls we call a sanctuary. It grows in the bedroom next to ours, eats at our dinner table, and says good night with a smile that hides 1,000 sharpened blades. In the quiet suburbia of Middle America, there is a myth we all subscribe to. The myth of the quiet neighbor. We see a large house with a manicured lawn, hear the distant sound of children's laughter, and assume that safety is a permanent resident. But in the summer of 2015, in a town called Broken Arrow, that myth didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000,000 bloody pieces. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. This isn't just a story about a crime. It is a descent into the minds of 2 brothers who decided that infamy was worth more than the lives of those who gave them breath. Robert and Michael Bever didn't want money, and they didn't want revenge for a specific wrong. They wanted to become legends of the macabre, They wanted to be the first names on a list of the world's most prolific killers. And to start their grand tour of slaughter, they chose the only people who truly knew them. To understand the horror that unfolded on July 22, 2015, we have to look at the town itself. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, is the kind of place people move to when they want to escape the chaos of the big city. It's a community built on traditional values, where the grass is always green and the crime rate is a distant afterthought. On the quiet cul-de-sac of Magnolia Court, the Bever family lived in a massive two-story brick home that spanned over 3,000 square feet. To any passerby, it was the literal embodiment of the American dream. The head of the household was David Bever, a 52-year-old computer scientist. David was a man of intellect, a tech-savvy provider who spent his days working to ensure his large family wanted for nothing. His wife, 44-year-old April, was the heart of the home. Together, they had 7 children, ranging from a tiny infant to the 18-year-old Robert. But there was a peculiar atmosphere surrounding the Bever residence. While other children in the neighborhood played in the streets or attended the local high school, the Bever children were almost never seen. David and April were extremely protective. Some would say reclusive. All 7 children were homeschooled. They didn't have Facebook accounts. They didn't go to prom. They didn't even have friends in the traditional sense. The walls of that 3,000 square foot house weren't just a shelter. They were a fortress. The parents sought to shield their brood from what they perceived as the poison of the outside world. But in their attempt to keep the world out, they inadvertently trapped a different kind of poison inside. Robert Bever, the eldest brother, was the architect of the family's isolation. At 18, Robert was a young man who seemed to exist entirely within his own head. He was thin, with a pale complexion that suggested he rarely saw the Oklahoma sun. While his father worked with computers to build a future, Robert used his laptop to explore the darkest corners of human history. He became obsessed with mass shooters, specifically the perpetrators of the Columbine High School massacre. He didn't see them as villains. He saw them as pioneers. His younger brother, 16-year-old Michael, was his shadow. In the dynamic of the Bever brothers, Robert was the leader, the philosopher of death, and Michael was the eager disciple. They shared a bedroom that became a laboratory for their twisted ambitions. While their parents thought they were upstairs studying their lessons, the boys were actually tracking the arrival of packages. Using money earned from a part-time job at a local IT company, Robert began stockpiling. It started small, a few survival knives, a tactical vest. But soon, the bedroom closet was filled with a terrifying arsenal. Kabar knives, hatchets, daggers, and over 2,000 rounds of ammunition. Robert's plan was meticulously documented in a series of journals. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to outdo everyone who came before him. He spoke of a strike that would begin in Broken Arrow and move across the country, targeting random locations to achieve a body count of at least 50 people. He wanted to be famous. He wanted people to look at his face and feel the kind of cold, paralyzing fear that he felt for a world he didn't belong to. The brothers even had a nickname for their impending mission, the Startup. They viewed their family not as people, but as the first test subjects for their equipment. They practiced their movements in the dark, learning how to move silently through the hallways of their own home. They even planned to build armies of robots, equipped with blades to help them increase the efficiency of their massacres. It sounds like the plot of a low-budget horror movie, but for Robert and Michael, it was a business plan. As July 2015 approached, the tension inside the house was invisible to the neighbors. David and April continued their routine, unaware that the 2 boys they had raised in total isolation were now viewing them as obstacles to be removed. Robert would later say that he felt nothing for his parents, no hatred, but also no love. They were merely the first characters in a script he had written in blood. The sun set on July 22nd like any other day in Oklahoma. The temperature was a humid 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cicadas were buzzing in the trees surrounding Magnolia Court. Inside the house, the younger siblings were getting ready for bed. The youngest, a 2-year-old girl, was already asleep. Crystal, 13, and Victoria, 7, were in their rooms. Christopher, 10, and Daniel, 7, were likely playing quietly. They had no idea that in the room upstairs, Robert and Michael were putting on their tactical gear. They were sharpening their knives. They were checking the straps on their body armor. The quiet neighbor was about to become the site of the most gruesome crime in the history of the state, and the silence of Magnolia Court was about to be broken forever. To the outside world, the Bever home was a fortress of silence, but inside, it was a pressure cooker of escalating madness. To understand how two teenagers could contemplate the annihilation of their own blood, we have to look at the hierarchy established between the brothers. Robert Bever, at 18, was the undisputed master of this dark domain. He wasn't just Michael's older brother, he was his mentor, his king, and his god. Robert possessed a chillingly articulate way of speaking, a byproduct of years of isolation, and a diet of extremist internet forums and true crime manifestos. He didn't just hate his life, he viewed himself as a superior being trapped in a mundane reality. He had convinced 16-year-old Michael that they were the enlightened ones. In Robert's twisted philosophy, the rest of the world, including their parents and siblings, were merely background characters. They were non-player characters in a simulation that Robert intended to win. Their relationship was built on a foundation of shared secrets. While their 5 younger siblings were kept on a strict schedule of chores and homeschooling, Robert and Michael were crafting a legacy of blood. They spent hours in their shared bedroom, the door locked, discussing the startup. This wasn't a business venture. It was a blueprint for a cross-country massacre. Robert had a specific vision. He told Michael that they wouldn't just be killers, they would be legends. He spoke of acquiring body armor, building an army of robots, equipped with blades to maximize efficiency, and eventually heading to a major city to commit a shooting that would dwarf the tragedies of the past. But for the startup to begin, they needed capital, and they needed to eliminate the only people who might notice they were missing. Their family became, in their minds, the first test subjects. They began to view their parents, David and April, not as protectors, but as obstacles. Robert would later describe his parents as hateful and controlling, yet he could never point to specific instances of abuse. It seemed their primary sin was simply existing within the same 4 walls as Robert's grand ambitions. The brothers spent months preparing. Using the money Robert earned from a part-time job, they began ordering equipment online. It arrived in packages that the parents never bothered to inspect. Inside were tactical vests, heavy-duty belts, and a collection of blades that looked like something out of a medieval nightmare. They had knives designed for gutting, daggers for stabbing, and hatchets for the heavy work. They even practiced. In the dead of night, while the house was silent, Robert and Michael would move through the hallways in their full tactical gear. They learned every creak in the floorboards. They timed how long it took to get from one bedroom to the next. They were athletes training for a sport where the only prize was death. There was a profound, slow burn to their descent. It wasn't a sudden snap. It was a calculated, cold-blooded progression. Robert would watch his younger siblings play, the 7-year-old Daniel, the 10-year-old Christopher, and he didn't see brothers. He saw targets. He saw points on a leaderboard. Michael, however, showed occasional flickers of doubt. In later interviews, he would admit that he didn't really want to die, and he didn't necessarily want to kill. But the pull of Robert's personality was like a gravity well. He was terrified of being left behind. He was terrified of being ordinary. Robert had promised him a place in history, and Michael was willing to pay the price in blood to stay by his brother's side. By mid-July 2015, the preparation was complete. They had the gear, they had the weapons, and they had the date. The atmosphere in the house on those final days must have been surreal. Imagine sitting at the dinner table, passing the salt to a mother who is worried about your education, while in your pocket, you are clutching a schedule for her execution. Robert and Michael played their roles perfectly. They were the quiet boys. They were the good sons. But the startup was no longer a fantasy. The gear was packed. The knives were sharpened to a razor's edge. The brothers had even planned to record their mission on a GoPro camera to ensure their infamy was documented for the world to see. As the sun began to set on July 22, 2015, the temperature in Broken Arrow hovered around 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of Oklahoma humidity that sticks to your skin. Inside the house on Magnolia Court, the Bever family was settling in for the night. They thought they were safe behind their locked doors and high fences. They had no idea that the monsters weren't outside. The monsters were upstairs, tightening their bootlaces and checking the blades of their hatchets, waiting for the clock to strike 12. The night of July 22, 2015, felt heavy. The temperature had barely dropped below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air inside the house on Magnolia Court was thick with the scent of a regular family evening, faint traces of dinner, laundry detergent, and the silence of a home settling into sleep. But in the upstairs bedroom, the air was different. It was charged with the metallic tang of sharpened steel and the frantic, shallow breathing of two boys who were about to step out of their lives and into a nightmare. It was approximately 11:30 p.m. Robert and Michael didn't just wake up and decide to do this. They had dressed with the precision of soldiers. Tactical vests tightened over their chests, heavy work boots laced to the top, knife sheaths strapped to their legs. They looked like something out of a video game, a grotesque parody of the elite warriors Robert admired so much. The plan was simple. They would lure their siblings one by one, eliminate them quietly, and then move on to their parents. They wanted to keep the chaos to a minimum to ensure they could finish the entire startup before the police could even be notified. The first target was their 13-year-old sister, Crystal. Crystal was a sweet girl, someone who trusted her older brothers. When they called her into their bedroom, claiming they had something important to show her on the computer screen, she didn't hesitate. She walked into the room, likely expecting a joke or a video. Instead, she was met with a flash of cold steel. The brothers attacked her with a ferocity that defied logic. But Crystal wasn't a background character. She fought, she screamed, and in that moment, the silent plan Robert had spent months crafting evaporated. The screams tore through the quiet of the house. April Bever, hearing her daughter's cries, did what any mother would do. She ran toward the sound. She didn't call the police. She didn't grab a weapon. She ran to protect her child. As she reached the doorway, she was met not by her sons, but by two masked figures who no longer recognized her as their mother. Robert and Michael fell upon her in the hallway. It was a chaotic, brutal struggle. April was a small woman, but she fought with the desperation of a lioness. The brothers used multiple knives, stabbing her dozens of times. The carpet, once a neutral beige, was quickly stained a deep, permanent crimson. Downstairs, David Bever heard the commotion. He was a man of logic and tech, perhaps thinking it was a fall or a frantic argument. He ran up the stairs only to be met by his eldest son, Robert, wielding a hatchet and a knife. David was 52 years old, a strong man, but he was caught completely off guard. He died in the hallway, trying to reach his wife and daughter. The audio from that call is one of the most haunting artifacts in the history of Oklahoma crime. You can hear Daniel's voice, trembling, whispering, telling the dispatcher, "My brother is attacking my family." In the background, there is the sound of doors being kicked in, the heavy thud of boots, and then the chilling voice of one of the brothers, pretending to be a victim, trying to trick Daniel into opening the door. "Help me, Daniel, I'm hurt, open the door!" But Daniel didn't open it. He knew. He stayed on the line until the very end, until the sound of the door splintering echoed through the phone. Then the line went quiet. Robert and Michael moved through the house like ghosts with blades. They found 10-year-old Christopher and 7-year-old Daniel. They found 5-year-old Victoria. One by one, the test subjects were eliminated. The sheer number of wounds on the victims, some stabbed more than 20 or 30 times, showed a level of overkill that pointed to a profound, sickening detachment from reality. Yet, in the middle of this whirlpool of blood, a miracle occurred. Crystal, despite her horrific injuries, had managed to crawl away and hide, and the youngest child, the 2-year-old baby girl, was left untouched in her crib. Perhaps the brothers ran out of time, or perhaps even in their blackened hearts, there was a sliver of something they couldn't name that stayed their hands. When the first police officers arrived at Magnolia Court, the house was eerily dark. There were no lights on, no sirens yet. But as they stepped onto the porch, they saw the blood on the door handle. They heard a faint, rhythmic sound from inside, the sound of an alarm clock that no one would ever turn off. The brothers didn't stay to fight the police. They had a bug-out bag ready. They slipped out the back door and disappeared into the thick, wooded area behind the neighborhood, leaving behind a house that had been transformed from a family home into a monument of human depravity. When the officers finally breached the door, they were seasoned veterans, men who had seen car accidents and shootings. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for what was inside. They found David first, then April, then the children. The officers would later describe the scene as a sea of red. One officer noted that the smell of copper was so thick it felt like he was swallowing it, but the monsters were gone. Somewhere in the dark Oklahoma woods, Robert and Michael were listening to the sirens, thinking they had finally become the legends they always dreamed of being. But as the two officers stepped onto the porch of the Bever residence, the silence of the cul-de-sac felt wrong. It wasn't the silence of a sleeping neighborhood. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. One officer reached for the door handle. It was unlocked. As the door swung open, the smell hit them, a thick, metallic stench that seemed to coat the back of their throats. It was the smell of over 3 gallons of fresh blood cooling in the Oklahoma humidity. They didn't find a family in the middle of a fight. They found a slaughterhouse. In the dim light of their tactical flashlights, the hallway looked like a scene from a war zone. They found the bodies of David and April first. The carnage was so absolute that it was difficult, even for seasoned professionals, to process what they were seeing. But then, a sound, a faint, wet wheeze coming from the darkness of the kitchen. There, lying in a pool of crimson, was 13-year-old Crystal. She had been stabbed in the neck, her torso, her arms. She was fading, her eyes glazed with shock, but she was alive. As the officers knelt beside her, she managed to whisper the most terrifying words they would hear that night. "My brothers, they did this." The realization was a physical blow. This wasn't an outside intruder. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The monsters were still in the house, or they had just left. As more units arrived, the scene became a frantic, organized chaos. Paramedics rushed Crystal to a waiting helicopter to fly her to a trauma center 20 miles away. Inside, another officer found the 2-year-old baby, Autumn, miraculously unharmed in her crib, her wide eyes staring at the flashlight beams, unaware that her entire world had been annihilated in the rooms next to her. But the killers were gone. The search didn't take days. It took minutes, but those minutes felt like hours for the men and women standing in that house of horrors. A K9 unit was brought to the back of the property. The dog, a Belgian Malinois trained to track human scent, immediately caught a trail leading toward the thick, wooded area that buffered the neighborhood. The woods were a tangled mess of undergrowth and oak trees. The officers moved in a line, their weapons drawn, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They knew they were looking for 2 teenagers, but after seeing the house, they knew they were hunting predators. Less than 200 yards into the tree line, the dog began to bay. The flashlight beams cut through the brush, and there they were. Robert and Michael Bever were sitting on the damp earth, surrounded by the suburban woods they had played in as children. But they didn't look like children anymore. They were still wearing their tactical gear, the black vests, the heavy boots, the belts laden with empty knife sheaths. The contrast was staggering. Their clothes were saturated with blood, the blood of their parents, the blood of their siblings. It was matted in their hair and smeared across their pale faces. "Get down! Hands behind your head!" The brothers didn't fight. They didn't scream. Robert, the mastermind, simply looked up into the blinding light of the police flashlights and smiled. It wasn't a smirk of defiance. It was the chillingly calm expression of a man who had just completed a long day of work. Michael followed his brother's lead, surrendering with a quiet, almost submissive demeanor. As they were led out of the woods in handcuffs, the neighborhood was finally waking up. Neighbors stood on their porches in pajamas, watching as the 2 quiet boys were loaded into separate patrol cars. They saw the blood on the boys' clothes and the sheer number of ambulances lined up on the street. By the time the sun began to rise over Broken Arrow, the temperature climbing back toward 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the news had already begun to spread. This wasn't just a murder. It was the collapse of a family from within. The fortress on Magnolia Court was now a crime scene, wrapped in yellow tape, its windows dark and hollow. The search was over, but for the investigators, the true nightmare was just beginning, because now they had to ask why. And as they sat Robert and Michael down in separate interrogation rooms, they realized that the answers were far more disturbing than the crime itself. In one room sat 18-year-old Robert Bever. He was still dressed in the blood-soaked tactical gear he had been captured in, the black nylon vest, the heavy boots, the dark cargo pants. He didn't look like a prisoner. He didn't look like a boy who had just lost his entire family. He sat in the metal chair with a posture that was almost regal. His hands, still stained with a dark, dried crust under his fingernails, rested calmly on the table. When the detectives entered, they expected tears. They expected a frantic confession or a wall of defensive silence. What they got instead was a lecture. Robert spoke with a chilling clinical precision. He didn't avoid the details. He leaned into them. He described the startup as if it were a legitimate business venture that had simply run into a few technical difficulties. He told the investigators that his parents and siblings were just the beginning, a warm-up for a much larger mission. His goal, he stated without a tremor in his voice, was to become a famous serial killer. He wanted his name to be whispered alongside the likes of the Columbine shooters or the most prolific monsters in history. "I wanted to kill at least 50 people, he told the lead detective. "We were going to move from town to town. We were going to hit movie theaters, shopping malls, anywhere with a high density of people. We had the gear. We were just getting started." The detectives watched him through the two-way mirror, their stomachs churning. Robert wasn't just admitting to the crime, he was boasting about it. He talked about the efficiency of his knives and how he had researched the human anatomy to ensure his strikes were lethal. He even giggled, a high-pitched, childish sound, when describing how he had tricked his younger siblings into opening their doors. To Robert, the screams of his family weren't a tragedy, they were feedback on his performance. Michael began to cry, but they weren't tears of remorse for his parents. They were tears of fear for himself. He described the influence Robert had over him, how his older brother was the mastermind, and he was just following orders. Yet, when asked about the specific moments in the house, the kicking in of doors, the pursuit of his fleeing sisters, Michael couldn't deny his active participation. He was the one who had helped lure the children. He was the one who had stood by while Robert swung the hatchet. While the brothers were being questioned, a separate team of forensic investigators was back at the house on Magnolia Court, executing a search warrant that would reveal the true depth of the brothers' obsession. Inside the brothers' shared bedroom, they found the command center. On Robert's computer were thousands of files, detailed logs of weapon orders, maps of potential targets across the state, and a digital manifesto that outlined his philosophy of natural selection. He believed that by killing, he was ascending to a higher state of being. But the most damning evidence was the physical journal. In neat, almost elegant handwriting, Robert had documented the startup from its inception. He wrote about his armies of robots, plans to build automated killing machines that could be deployed into crowds. He had sketches of the tactical gear they would wear and a kill list that started with his family and ended with names of celebrities and politicians. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a GoPro camera and several spare batteries. The brothers hadn't just planned to kill their family, they had intended to film the entire massacre. They wanted the world to see the startup in high definition. They wanted the footage to serve as a recruitment tool for like-minded individuals. As the sun rose over Broken Arrow, the detectives realized they weren't dealing with a snap or a fit of rage. They were dealing with a calculated long-term project of annihilation. Robert Bever had spent years curating a world of darkness within the walls of that house, and Michael had been his most devoted student. "He's not a human being," one detective whispered as he watched Robert on the monitor, still smiling, still talking about the splatter patterns he had observed. "He's something else, entirely." The investigation was closing the circle, but the weight of the evidence was almost too much for the community to bear. The quiet boys were gone, replaced by the reality of two predators who had turned their own home into a testing ground for mass murder. Robert Bever did not want a trial. In his mind, a trial was a stage he no longer needed. He had already achieved his masterpiece. In 2016, he pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to kill. He didn't blink as the judge handed down 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Robert, this was simply the final chapter of his book. He was led away to a maximum security facility, destined to spend the next 50 or 60 years in a concrete box, a living ghost of his own ambition. But Michael Bever's path was more contentious. Because he was only 16 at the time of the murders, the law viewed him through a different lens. His defense team argued that he was a victim of his brother's extreme manipulation, a child groomed for slaughter by the only person he ever trusted. They painted a picture of a boy who was too weak to say no to a god. And what of the fortress on Magnolia Court? For months after the crime, the house stood as a grim tourist attraction. Drifters would park their cars across the street, staring at the brick walls, trying to catch a glimpse of the House of Horrors. The neighbors, the people who just wanted to forget the screams and the blue lights, couldn't take it. The house was a wound that wouldn't heal. In 2017, the city of Broken Arrow made a decision. They didn't sell the house. They didn't renovate it. They demolished it. Every brick, every floorboard that had soaked up the Bever family's blood was ground into dust and hauled away. In its place, they built Reflection Park. Today, it is a quiet green space with a gazebo and a winding path. There are no plaques mentioning the murders. There are no monuments to Robert and Michael. There is only the wind in the trees and the silence, a different kind of silence this time. A silence meant for peace, not for secrets. Robert and Michael weren't born in a gutter. They weren't raised by strangers. They were raised in a 3,000-square-foot home by parents who thought they were doing the right thing by keeping the poison of the world away from their children. But they forgot that isolation is its own kind of poison. In the absence of the world, Robert created his own. A world where life had no value, and infamy was the only currency worth collecting. Crystal and Autumn, the 2 survivors, are the living legacy of that night. One carries the scars of the blades, the other carries a void where a family should have been. They are the only ones who truly know what was lost in the startup. As you walk through Reflection Park today, it's easy to forget what happened on that spot. The grass is green, and the Oklahoma sun is warm. But if you listen closely to the rustle of the leaves, you realize that some stories never truly end. They just change shape. The Bever brothers wanted to be legends, but they ended up as a cautionary tale about the darkness that grows when we stop looking at each other. In the end, Robert and Michael didn't become icons. They became a footnote in a history of grief, and the only thing that remains of their grand mission is a quiet park where people go to remember and to hope that the silence stays peaceful this time. Stay vigilant, because the most dangerous monsters are the ones who share your last name. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. We often find comfort in the image of the family pillar. That one person who seems immune to the weight of the world, the one who fixes the broken fences and the broken spirits without ever asking for a hand in return. But there is a dangerous silence in those who carry everything, a point where the wood doesn't just bend, it splinters. In the rural reaches of Western Australia, there was a man who was the very definition of a rock. A man who built a sanctuary called Forever Dreaming for the people he loved most. But in the early morning hours of May 2018, that dream didn't just end. It was methodically, quietly extinguished by the very hand that built it. Tonight, we look into the shadows of a farm that promised peace, and the man who decided that the only way to protect his family was to ensure they never woke up again. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. It was here, on a lush 74-acre property, that 61-year-old Peter Miles and his 58-year-old wife, Cinda, lived their version of the Australian dream. They called their farm Forever Dreaming. To anyone passing by the gate, the name seemed fitting. It was a hobby farm filled with sheep, fruit trees, and the kind of rustic charm that only decades of hard work can produce. Peter was a man of the earth, tall, rugged, and gifted with the handyman's touch. There wasn't a tractor he couldn't fix or a problem he couldn't solve with a bit of grease and patience. In the community, he was the guy you called when things went wrong. He was reliable. He was steady. He was the ultimate patriarch. Cinda was his perfect counterpart. Warm, community-minded, and deeply devoted to her family, she was the heart of the farm. Together, they had built a life that seemed enviable. They had seen their children grow, and though life had dealt them a devastating blow years earlier, the loss of one of their sons, Sean, to suicide in 2005, they appeared to have found a way to carry that grief with grace. They poured their energy into their remaining children, and most importantly, their grandchildren. By 2018, the Forever Dreaming farm had become more than just a home for Peter and Cinda. It had become a sanctuary for their 35-year-old daughter, Katrina, and her 4 children. Katrina was a woman who lived for her boys, but her life was a constant, exhausting marathon. All 4 of her children, 13-year-old Tay, 12-year-old Rylan, 10-year-old Ari, and 8-year-old Caden, were on the autism spectrum. Raising one child with special needs is a challenge. Raising 4 is a feat of unimaginable strength. Katrina was a single mother, navigating a world that often felt ill-equipped to handle the unique needs of her sons. She had been homeschooling them, dedicated to providing a curriculum that catered to their individual spirits, but the pressure was immense. Eventually, the decision was made for Katrina and the boys to move into a separate house on Peter and Cinda's property. It seemed like the ideal solution. The boys had 74 acres of freedom to run, play, and explore. They were surrounded by animals and the unconditional love of their grandparents. Peter was the grandfather every boy dreams of. He taught them about the farm, showed them how to handle tools, and provided a masculine presence that was both firm and kind. To the outside world, the Miles family was a testament to resilience. They were the ideal rural family, supporting one another through the complexities of neurodivergence and the demands of farm life. But beneath the surface of this idyllic landscape, the rock was beginning to crumble. The financial reality of maintaining a large property while supporting an extended family was starting to weigh on Peter. At 61, the physical labor was getting harder, and the Forever Dreaming farm was becoming less of a dream and more of a mounting debt. Peter was a man who took pride in being the provider, the one who had all the answers. But as the bills piled up and the future of his grandchildren, boys who might always require significant care, loomed large in his mind, a dark, distorted logic began to take root. He looked at his wife, who worked so hard to keep the family together. He looked at his daughter, who was often at her wit's end, trying to balance the needs of 4 energetic, neurodivergent boys. And he looked at his grandsons, whom he loved with a fierce, protective intensity. In the quiet moments on the farm, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long across the fields, Peter Miles didn't see a family that would persevere. He saw a family that was suffering, and he convinced himself that he was the only one who could end that suffering. He began to plan, not a getaway, not a renovation, but a final, permanent resolution. He began to look at his firearms, not as tools for the farm, but as instruments of mercy. The man who fixed everything was about to break the one thing that could never be repaired. The community of Osmington slept soundly, unaware that the patriarch they all respected was sitting in the dark, watching the clock, waiting for the precisely right moment to destroy everything he had ever built. The air that night was cool, probably dropping into the low 50s Fahrenheit, typical for a Western Australian autumn. The house was quiet. The boys were likely exhausted from a day of play, tucked into their beds in the house they shared with their mother. Peter stood in the silence of his own home, the weight of a decision he had already made pressing down on him like a physical force. He wasn't the handyman anymore. He was a man who had decided that the dream was over, and he was the only one who could turn out the lights. When they married and eventually secured those 74 acres in Osmington, about 12 miles from the heart of Margaret River, it felt like a victory. They were building something. They weren't just clearing land, they were planting roots. In the early years, the honeymoon phase of their life was defined by the sound of hammers hitting nails and the smell of freshly turned red earth. Peter built the sheds, the fences, the very foundations of their life. He was the man who could handle everything, and Cinda was his greatest supporter. They raised their children there, in the quiet isolation of the bush, teaching them the value of the land and the importance of family. But even in those early golden years, there were shadows, small fractures in the pillar that no one seemed to notice. Peter was a man who bottled his emotions, a characteristic common in rural men of his generation. He didn't speak of his fears, he just worked harder. If a crop failed or a tractor broke, he didn't complain. He just stayed out in the shed until long after the sun went down. The first truly devastating blow to the family's foundation came in 2005. Their son, Sean, took his own life. It was a tragedy that would have leveled most families, but the Miles family did what they always did. They tightened the circle. They leaned on each other. Peter, as the patriarch, became even more of a protector. He bore the weight of that loss internally, perhaps believing that if he stayed strong enough, the rest of his family wouldn't have to feel the floor give way. But grief like that, it doesn't just disappear. It leaches into the soil. It waits in the corners of the rooms. And for Peter, it seemingly reinforced a dark, subconscious lesson, that sometimes life is simply too much to bear. As the years passed, their daughter Katrina grew up and started a family of her own. She was a mirror of her parents' resilience, but her path was anything but easy. She had 4 beautiful boys, Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden. As they grew, it became clear that each of them was unique, navigating the world through the lens of autism. Katrina was a warrior for her children, but by the mid-2000s, she was a single mother carrying a burden that was physically and emotionally exhausting. In an act of profound love and perhaps a bit of desperation, Peter and Cinda invited Katrina and the boys to move back to the farm. This was meant to be the ultimate solution, a multi-generational sanctuary where the boys could have the space they needed, and Katrina could have the support she so desperately craved. For a while, it worked. The honeymoon of this new arrangement saw the boys running through the paddocks, their laughter echoing off the corrugated iron of the barn. Peter was in his element, teaching his grandsons how to be farm boys, showing them the sheep and the fruit trees. He was their hero. But this new life came with a crushing price tag. Supporting a household of 7 on a hobby farm at age 61 is not a dream. It is a relentless, 24-hour-a-day job. The red flags started appearing, though they were subtle at first. A missed bill here, a lingering look of exhaustion there. Peter was no longer the young man who could conquer the bush. The property was aging, and so was he. The financial strain of maintaining the 74-acre farm, combined with the realization that his grandsons would likely require lifelong care and support, began to distort his perspective. He began to obsess over the future. He saw his daughter's exhaustion, the way she poured every ounce of herself into homeschooling and caring for 4 neurodivergent children. He saw his wife's aging hands, and he saw the boys, growing older in a world that he felt wouldn't understand them. In Peter's mind, the rock wasn't just crumbling, it was being pulverized. He started to view the farm not as a sanctuary, but as a trap. The silence in the main house grew heavier. Friends would later recall that Peter seemed fine. He was still the man who helped his neighbors. But those closest to him might have noticed the way his eyes lingered a bit too long on the horizon. The forever dreaming farm was becoming a nightmare of responsibility. He felt he was the only one who could see the truth, that they were all heading toward a slow, painful decline. He didn't talk about the debt. He didn't talk about the way his heart skipped a beat when he thought about what would happen to the boys when he was gone. He just sat on the porch as the cool Australian autumn set in, watching the shadows stretch across the 74 acres he had worked his whole life to save. He looked at the guns in his cabinet, tools he had used for years to protect his livestock from predators, and his mind began to twist their purpose. The honeymoon was over. The red flags were no longer just warnings. They were, in Peter's warped reality, a call to action. He had spent his life fixing things for his family, and he had convinced himself that the ultimate fix was to make sure they all went to sleep, together, and never had to face the cold, hard morning of a world he no longer believed in. In the smaller house on the property, the 4 boys, Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden, were likely settling into their evening routine. For children on the autism spectrum, routine isn't just a preference, it's a lifeline. It's the framework that makes a chaotic world feel manageable. Katrina, their mother, would have been at the center of that whirlwind, orchestrating dinner, managing the sensory needs of 4 growing boys, and perhaps preparing for the next day's homeschooling lessons. Up at the main house, Cinda was likely finishing her own day's work. Maybe she was tidying the kitchen or exchanging a few quiet words with Peter before bed. They had been married for decades. They moved in a practiced, silent rhythm. But Peter was moving to a different beat that night. He wasn't thinking about the next morning's chores. He was looking at the guns he had owned for years. In rural Australia, a firearm is often just another tool, something used to deal with a suffering animal or a predator threatening the flock. But that night, Peter had redefined their purpose. As the clock ticked toward midnight, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over Osmington Road. The temperature dropped into the low 50s Fahrenheit, a crisp, biting autumn night. The kind of night where you huddle under the blankets and find comfort in the warmth of a shared home. But there was no comfort in the main house of Forever Dreaming. It is believed that the horror began in the early, dark hours of Friday, May 11th. While the rest of the world was tucked away in dreams, Peter Miles was wide awake, fully dressed, and possessed by a cold, clinical determination. The first act of this tragedy unfolded in the main house. Cinda, the woman who had stood by him for more than 30 years, was shot while she lay in her bed. There was no struggle reported, no sign that she ever saw it coming. The man she trusted above all others had walked into their sanctuary and ensured she would never wake up. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a quiet, sudden end to a life spent building a family. But Peter wasn't finished. He stepped out of the main house and into the cool night air. The grass was likely slick with dew. He had to walk about 200 feet, a short distance that must have felt like miles in the silence of the bush, toward the second house where his daughter and grandsons were sleeping. He entered Katrina's home with the same methodical, terrifying purpose. He moved through the rooms where his grandsons lay. Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden, boys who looked up to him, boys who saw him as their protector, were killed in their beds. It is a detail that haunts the investigators to this day. The idea that these children, who already navigated a world that felt overwhelming, met their end in the one place they were supposed to be safe. Then, there was Katrina, a mother who had fought every single day for her children's future. She was found in the doorway of her bedroom. It's a haunting image. The suggestion that she might have heard something, a floorboard creaking, a muffled sound, and stepped out to protect her boys, only to come face to face with her own father holding a weapon. The massacre was over in minutes, but the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a sleeping farm. It was the heavy, stagnant air of a tomb. Peter Miles then did something that few perpetrators of such crimes ever do. He didn't flee. and he didn't immediately turn the gun on himself. He walked back to the main house. He sat down. He waited for the sun to start its approach to the horizon. At 5:15 a.m., the silence was broken by the ringing of a telephone at the Bustleton police station. When the dispatcher answered, they didn't hear a panicked scream or a frantic plea for help. They heard the voice of an older man, steady, calm, almost polite. "I've just killed my family," the voice said. He gave the address, 1024 Osmington Road. He spoke clearly, providing the details with the same precision he used to fix a fence or calibrate a piece of farm equipment. He told the dispatcher that there were several bodies, and then he hung up. The police were dispatched immediately, their sirens cutting through the pre-dawn stillness of the Margaret River bushland. But by the time they turned into the long driveway of Forever Dreaming, Peter Miles had completed his final act. He was found on the porch of the main house, the gun nearby. The man who handled everything had finally closed the book. The patriarch had decided that the only way to save his family from the struggles of life was to take them into the darkness with him. As the first rays of light began to touch the paddocks, the Forever Dreaming farm was no longer a home. It was a crime scene of unimaginable scale. The sheep were still in the fields. The fruit trees were still standing. But the heart of the family had been methodically, quietly, cut out by the very man who was supposed to keep it beating. The community would wake up hours later to the news that Australia had just seen its worst mass shooting in 22 years. But in those quiet moments just before dawn, as the police stood on the porch looking at the devastation, the only sound was the wind and the distant, mocking call of a bird, echoing over 74 acres of shattered dreams. When that 5:15 a.m. call reached the Bustleton police station, the air was still thick with the pre-dawn mist that often rolls across the Margaret River region. The dispatcher, used to the typical calls of a Friday morning, minor accidents or perhaps a stray animal on the road, was met instead with a voice that sounded as though it were reading a grocery list. Peter Miles didn't sound like a man who had just destroyed his entire world. He sounded like a man who had completed a task. The first responders who sped toward 1024 Osmington Road likely felt a knot of dread tightening in their chests. It's about a 45-minute drive from Bustleton to that patch of rural land. 45 minutes of silence, broken only by the crackle of the radio and the roar of the engine. As the police cruisers tore down the narrow, winding roads, their headlights cutting through the darkness, they were heading toward a scene that would permanently alter their lives. When the first patrol car turned into the long gravel driveway of the farm, the sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon. The 74-acre property was beautiful in the early light, the kind of peace that feels sacred. But as the officers stepped out of their vehicles, the silence was absolute. No one came out to greet them. There were no sounds of children waking up for school, just the ticking of cooling engines and the distant, rhythmic bleating of sheep in the paddocks. The search began on the porch of the main house. It didn't take long to find the source of the 5:15 a.m. call. Peter Miles was there. Still. The man who had been the pillar of Osmington was now a part of the carnage he had created. A single firearm lay nearby, the instrument he had used to finalize his solution. But the officers knew the call mentioned a family. They had to go inside. Stepping into the main house was like stepping into a refrigerated memory. Everything was in its place. The kitchen was clean. The living room was tidy. It looked like a home that was waiting for its owners to wake up and start the day. But in the bedroom, they found Cinda. The woman who had spent her life cultivating Forever Dreaming had been silenced in the very place she should have been most secure. There was no sign of a struggle, just the clinical, horrifying efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. As more units arrived, The perimeter was expanded. Forensic teams and detectives began the grim walk toward the second house, the one where Katrina lived with her 4 boys. This was the moment where the scale of the tragedy began to crush the spirits of even the most seasoned officers. They moved through the smaller house with bated breath. In the first bedroom, a child. In the second, another. And another. Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden. 4 boys, aged 8 to 13, who had been killed while they slept. The detectives found them tucked in, their rooms filled with the toys and books of a normal childhood. These were children who lived with the daily challenges of autism, children who relied on the structure and safety of their home. To see that sanctuary turned into a graveyard was a blow that many of the first responders would never truly recover from. Finally, they found Katrina. She was positioned near the doorway, a final, silent testament to a mother's instinct. Even in the face of the unthinkable, she had seemingly tried to move, tried to protect her sons from the person they trusted most in the world. The search was over by mid-morning, but the investigation was just beginning. This wasn't a search for a suspect, it was a search for why. How does a man go from fixing fences to murdering his grandchildren? The police cordoned off the entire 74-acre property, turning the farm into a massive outdoor laboratory for death. By 9 a.m., the news began to ripple through the town of Margaret River. In a community where everyone knows everyone, where the Miles family was a household name, the shock was physical. People stood on their porches, watching the helicopters circle overhead. The local diners went quiet as the radio bulletins confirmed the numbers. 7 dead. 3 generations of one family. Gone. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting a bright, cruel light over the forever dreaming sign at the gate, the reality set in. There would be no miracle. No one was hiding in the bush. No one had escaped. The search had revealed the total, absolute destruction of a family line. It was the most quiet I've ever heard this valley, one neighbor would later say. Usually, you hear the boys playing or the tractors. That morning, even the birds seemed to stop singing. The forensic teams worked in silence, documenting the positions of the bodies and the trajectory of the bullets. They found Peter's firearms, his notes, his financial records. They were looking for the splinters in the rock, the evidence of a man who had been breaking for a long time. The community of Osmington didn't just lose neighbors that day. They lost their sense of safety. If a man like Peter Miles, a man so respected, so capable, could do this, then what was real? The search for answers would take months. But on that Friday morning, as the bodies were slowly removed from the farm in a somber procession, the only thing that was clear was that the dream was over, and the nightmare had only just begun. The detectives first secured the perimeter of the 2 homes. The distance between the main residence and the smaller house where Katrina lived with her boys was about 200 feet. A short walk across a grassy expanse that now felt like a corridor to the underworld. Forensic teams in white coveralls moved like shadows across the property, their cameras clicking rhythmically, capturing the final frozen moments of 3 generations. They found 3 long guns, rifles, registered to Peter Miles. Ballistics would later confirm these were the instruments of the family's destruction. But the most haunting part of the physical evidence wasn't the weapons themselves. It was the lack of struggle. In every room, the story was the same. The victims were found in their beds, tucked under blankets, their bodies positioned in ways that suggested they never even woke up. This wasn't a frenzied attack. It was a cold, calculated execution. Toxicology reports would be ordered to see if the family had been sedated, but the initial findings pointed to something even more chilling. They had simply trusted the man who walked into their rooms in the dead of night. Peter knew the layout of those houses like the back of his hand. He knew which floorboards creaked and which doors swung silent. He had used that intimate knowledge to move like a wraith through the dark. As the physical evidence was bagged and tagged, Another team of investigators began digging into the digital and financial remains of Peter's life. They found that the forever dreaming farm was no longer the sanctuary it appeared to be. The property had been on the market for some time, listed for over $1 million, but it wasn't selling. Peter, once a successful farm manager, had been struggling to find consistent work. At 61, in a youth-driven economy, he was feeling the walls close in. The financial records painted a picture of a man drowning in a sea of red ink, trying to support his wife, his daughter, and 4 grandchildren with special needs on a hobby farm that was hemorrhaging cash. But money is rarely the sole reason for a massacre. The detectives turned their attention to the psychological autopsy of Peter Miles. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and distant relatives, searching for the crack in the facade. What they found was a man who had never truly recovered from the suicide of his son, Sean, in 2005. That loss had acted as a slow-release poison in his mind. In Peter's warped logic, life was a series of inevitable tragedies, and as the patriarch, it was his job to prevent further suffering. The investigation revealed that Peter had been increasingly obsessed with the future of his 4 grandsons. Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden were all on the autism spectrum. While they were loved fiercely, Peter saw only the hardship ahead for them. He saw a world that was cruel to those who were different. He saw his daughter, Katrina, struggling as a single mother, pouring every ounce of her energy into her boys. To Peter, the mercy wasn't just in ending their lives, it was in saving them from a future he believed would only bring pain. In the weeks following the shooting, police uncovered a series of letters and notes Peter had written. They weren't suicide notes in the traditional sense. They were more like manifestos of despair. He spoke of the burden he carried and his belief that the family would be better off together in the after. It was the ultimate expression of a God complex, the idea that he alone had the right to decide when the story ended for 7 people. The community's reaction was a mix of grief and a burgeoning, righteous anger. He wasn't a monster, some said, struggling to reconcile the man who fixed their tractors with the man who shot children in their sleep. But as the details of the investigation leaked, the cold-blooded nature of the shootings, the hours Peter spent sitting with the bodies before calling the police, the mercy-killing narrative began to sour. The detectives realized that this wasn't an act of love, it was the ultimate act of control. Peter Miles couldn't control his finances, he couldn't control the aging of his body, and he couldn't control the challenges his grandsons faced, so he took control of their deaths. The forensic locksmiths and tech experts combed through Peter's computer, finding searches related to firearm efficiency and painless ways to end a life. This had been planned. This wasn't a snap or a moment of temporary insanity. It was a methodical, months-long descent into a dark philosophy. The investigation even looked into the 5:15 a.m. call itself. They analyzed the tone of his voice, which experts described as depersonalized. He had already checked out. By the time he picked up that phone, he was already a ghost. As the investigation into the Osmington shooting drew to a close, the major crime squad was left with a pile of evidence that pointed to a familicide-suicide born from a lethal cocktail of financial stress, unresolved grief, and a toxic sense of masculine duty. There were no unidentified fingerprints, no mysterious intruders, and no dark white Mercedes lurking in the shadows. The monster wasn't under the bed. He was the one who had tucked the children into it. The 74 acres of forever dreaming were officially cleared of any other suspects, leaving the community of Margaret River to grapple with the reality that the man they trusted to hold the world up was the one who let it fall. The final report by the coroner would eventually state that Peter Miles acted alone, fueled by a distorted sense of altruism. But for the detectives who walked through those 2 houses, no report could ever truly capture the weight of the silence they found there. They left the property as they found it, beautiful, isolated, and utterly broken. The investigation was over, but the echo of those shots in the middle of the night would stay with the town of Osmington for generations to come. However, the court of public opinion and the formal coroner's inquest served as the final somber stage of this tragedy. Rumors about the nighttime crime had instantly spread throughout the Margaret River community and far beyond, across the vast expanses of Australia. People struggled to reconcile the image of the charming, energetic grandfather they knew with the man who had methodically eliminated 3 generations of his own blood. It was a blow below the belt for a town that prided itself on its safety and its connection to the land. The official resolution came through the Coroner's Court of Western Australia. The inquest, led by State Coroner Ross Fogliani, was a clinical, painful reconstruction of the events leading up to that Friday morning. It wasn't about guilt that had been established the moment Peter called the Busselton station. It was about the unbearable pain that had been burning inside the Miles family home for years. The investigation into Peter's background confirmed the dark reality that had been hidden behind the forever dreaming sign. Detectives revealed a man who felt he was at a dead end. The financial strain was immense. The farm was a beautiful but expensive trap, and Peter's age made finding a new elite career path nearly impossible. He had watched his daughter, Katrina, struggle to provide for 4 neurodivergent boys, and in his twisted mind, he decided that life was a failed venture. A key figure in this resolution was Aaron Cockman, the biological father of the 4 boys. For Aaron, the news of his children's deaths was an unimaginable tragedy that seemed like complete madness. He had been embroiled in a difficult custody situation, and suddenly, his entire world was gone. Aaron's presence during the aftermath provided a heartbreaking perspective on the black ingratitude Peter had shown to the very concept of life. He spoke of his boys, Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden, as absolute light in his life, and the fact that their grandfather had snuffed that light out was a wound that would never truly heal. The coroner's findings were as direct as they were devastating. Peter Miles was found to have acted with premeditated and systematic intent. This was not a snap or a moment of absolute incomprehension. He had planned the order of the shootings, ensured his firearms were ready, and even waited until his daughter and grandsons were in their most vulnerable state, asleep in their beds. The mercy-killing narrative that some had initially whispered was firmly rejected. The coroner made it clear this was an act of extreme family violence, a targeted attack fueled by a man's desire to control a situation that he felt had slipped from his grasp. The resolution also shed light on the mental health crisis that had been simmering for over a decade. Peter had been shaking as if in a fever internally ever since the suicide of his son in 2005. He had never sought professional help, choosing instead to be the face of the family, a consulting consultant of strength that was entirely fabricated. The inquest concluded that Peter had bitterly succumbed to the same darkness that had taken his son, but unlike his son, he refused to go alone. In the end, the forever dreaming property was sold, and the 2 houses, once filled with the sounds of 4 energetic boys, were eventually demolished. The community had to learn to live without the Miles family, a process that left them completely out of control with grief for months. The legal sentence was a 110-year prison of silence for those who remained, a legacy of unbearable pain that would haunt the Margaret River region for generations. There was no gavel, no cheering in the gallery, and no sense of justice prevailing. There was only the cold, hard fact that 3 generations had been repaid with black ingratitude by the man they loved most. But as this tragedy has shown us, the most dangerous predator isn't always the one lurking in the bush outside the fence. Sometimes, it's the one who holds the keys to the gate. Peter Miles wanted to save his family from a future he couldn't control, but in his desperate, lonely logic, he became the very horror they needed saving from. Cinda, Katrina, and those four beautiful, unique boys, Tay, Rylan, Ari, and Caden, deserved a future of their own making, one defined by their own resilience, rather than a conclusion dictated by a man who had lost his way in the dark. The houses are gone, the sheep have been moved, and the red earth has reclaimed the footprints of the 7 who lived there. But the echo of that Friday morning serves as a haunting reminder that the rocks we lean on are only human, and when the burden of the world becomes too much to bear, we must find the courage to reach out before the dream turns into a nightmare from which no one wakes up. The sun still rises over Osmington, but for one family it will always be 5:15 a.m., a moment frozen in time, where the silence is the only thing left to tell the story. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. In the small town of Enoch, a place where everyone knows your name and your Sunday best is a matter of public record, the silence of January 4th, 2023 was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a winter morning. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that had fallen over a large, beautiful home on Albert Drive. From the outside, the house looked like the very definition of the American dream, a two-story testament to hard work and divine favor. But behind those walls, the clocks had stopped. We often ask ourselves, what does evil look like? We expect it to have a snarling face, to live in the shadows, or to carry the stench of a life lived in the gutter. But the truth is far more terrifying. Sometimes evil wears a pressed white shirt and a silk tie. Sometimes it has a successful career, a charismatic smile, and 5 beautiful children who call it daddy. What happens when the ideal man realizes he can no longer control the world he built? In the case of the Haight family, the answer wasn't a quiet exit or a humble plea for forgiveness. It was a total, calculated annihilation. This is not just a story about a crime. It is an exploration of the darkness that can fester behind a white picket fence, and the devastating price paid by those who dared to seek a life of their own. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Tausha Haight, born in 1982, was the kind of woman who made the world feel a little softer just by being in it. Her friends described her as a light, a woman whose primary language was kindness. She wasn't just a mother, she was a force of nature when it came to her children. Whether it was organizing church youth groups or cheering at a basketball game, Tausha was present. She was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who checked in on neighbors, the one who held the chaotic energy of a 7-person household together with grace. Then there were the children, 5 lives that were supposed to be just beginning. Macy, 17 years old, a high school senior on the brink of adulthood, full of the vibrance and potential that only a teenager with the world at her feet can possess. Riley, 12. A girl finding her own voice, caught in that sweet, fleeting transition between childhood and her teenage years. Ammon and Sienna, 7-year-old twins. A duo of energy and laughter, the kind of kids who made the house feel constantly alive. And finally, Gavin, just 4 years old, the baby of the family, with a smile that could melt the hardest of hearts. To complete the picture, Tausha's mother, 78-year-old Gail Earle, had recently moved in. Gail was there to support her daughter through a difficult time, providing the kind of maternal wisdom and extra set of hands that a busy mother of 5 desperately needed. And then there was the patriarch, Michael Haight. Born in 1980, Michael was a man who seemed to have figured out the secret to life. He was a successful insurance agent for Allstate, a man who dealt in the business of protection and good hands. In Enoch, Michael was respected. He was an active member of his church, a man who participated in his community, and a father who provided a life of luxury. Their home on Albert Drive was spacious, over 3,000 square feet of comfort, with a large yard where the kids could play under the watchful eye of the red Utah mountains. But as any insurance agent knows, the policy doesn't always cover the damage on the inside. While the neighbors saw a man who worked hard and loved his family, a very different Michael existed behind closed doors. He was a man obsessed with the image of success. In a community where your standing is often tied to the perceived perfection of your family, Michael viewed his wife and children not as individuals, but as assets. They were extensions of his ego, and like any asset, Michael believed they belonged to him, body and soul. The cracks hadn't just appeared overnight. In fact, as far back as 2020, the authorities had been alerted to the reality of the Haight household. There was a secret investigation, a look into Michael's behavior that suggested the good guy image was a mask. Reports of physical intimidation and emotional abuse had reached social services. Macy, the eldest daughter, had even spoken to investigators about her father's temper, about the way he would grab her or scream until the walls shook. But in Enoch, there is a powerful urge to keep things within the family, to pray more, to try harder, to maintain the facade at all costs. The 2020 investigation was eventually closed without charges. Michael was allowed to keep his seat in the pews and his place at the head of the table. He was given a second chance to be the man everyone thought he was. He didn't use it to change. He used it to tighten his grip. By late 2022, the tension inside the house on Albert Drive had become a living thing. Tausha, the woman of light, was starting to realize that you cannot fix a man who sees his family as property. She was 40 years old, a mother of 5, and she was tired of living in a kingdom built on fear. She began to do something Michael Haight could not tolerate. She began to plan her exit. But inside that architecture, a different story was being written, one of silent surveillance and escalating terror. For Michael Haight, love was synonymous with ownership. As the years passed, the honeymoon glow was replaced by a cold, calculating need for total transparency, not of the soul, but of the record. Michael didn't just want to be with Tausha, he wanted to inhabit her digital life. By his own admission to investigators, he frequently confiscated Tausha's iPad and cell phone, meticulously scrolling through her messages to ensure she wasn't speaking negatively about him or his family to the outside world. It was a digital leash, a way to ensure that the facade remained uncracked from within. The first major tremors in the Haight household didn't start with a shout, but with a plea for help from the eldest. In 2017, the violence that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. Macy, then just a young teenager, would later recount a pattern of behavior that was far from the quality time described in her father's eventual sanitized obituary. The red flags were not just ripples, they were tidal waves. The 2020 investigation, authorities were called after reports surfaced that Michael had become assaultive. Macy told police her father had choked her, shook her, and grabbed her by the shoulders so violently that her head banged against the wooden frame of the couch. The mouthy defense. When confronted by police, Michael's response was a chilling glimpse into his psyche. He dismissed the reports as a misunderstanding, labeling his 14-year-old daughter as mouthy and suggesting that his anger was a justified reaction to his own personal stresses, such as his father's death. The 2021 highway incident. During a family drive, Michael, in a fit of rage, suddenly slammed on the brakes while traveling at high speed. The force was so great it left red welts from the seatbelts across the bodies of his children, a terrifying display of how he could weaponize even the simplest family outing. Despite these incidents, the heavy weight of community expectation and Tausha's own bottomless hope kept the door locked. Tausha told investigators in 2020 that she didn't want to file criminal charges. She believed, or perhaps she needed to believe, that the police visit would be the wake-up call Michael required to change. She wanted her husband to be the man the neighbors saw, the man she had married. But wake-up calls only work on those who want to wake up. For Michael, the investigation wasn't a warning to change. It was an insult to his authority. He began to issue a new kind of ultimatum. He told Tausha that if she ever tried to leave him, he would make her life hell or take his own life. It was the ultimate trap: stay and suffer, or leave and be responsible for a tragedy. For years, Tausha lived in that narrow space between fear and duty. She watched as her children grew up in a home where they had to tower over them to feel intimidated, as Macy described it. By December 2022, the light that friends saw in Tausha was finally directed toward the exit. On December 21st, just 4 days before Christmas, Tausha Haight filed for divorce. She didn't know it then, but in Michael's mind, a divorce wasn't a legal proceeding. It was a declaration of war, and if he couldn't own the kingdom, he would ensure there was no kingdom left to rule. 2 weeks had passed since Tausha had filed the papers. 2 weeks since the ideal life Michael had curated began to dissolve into legal filings and custody schedules. Michael was a man who lived by the clock and the ledger, but his movements on this final Tuesday were different. There was a finality to his errands. Earlier that day, he had walked into his office and left a paycheck on his secretary's desk, an uncharacteristic move, a gesture of settling accounts. On his own desk, he left living trust paperwork, precisely organized, as if he were preparing for a long, permanent absence. While Michael was settling the business of his life, Tausha was trying to build a new one. That afternoon, she met with her divorce attorney to discuss the financial fallout of the split. She was worried, yes, but she was also hopeful. Just 2 days earlier, she had reported an unsettling development to her family. Michael had taken the guns. Not just his, but hers too. He had cleaned the house of its defenses, leaving her, in the words of her relatives, vulnerable. But even with the weapons gone, Tausha sought the comfort of her community. That evening, as the stars began to pierce the black Utah sky, Tausha and her daughters attended a church group for young women. Neighbors saw them. They looked normal. There was no screaming, no outward sign that they were living in the shadow of a predator. They were simply a mother and her children, finding solace in their faith before returning to the house on Albert Drive. They returned home around 9 p.m. At that same hour, Michael picked up his phone. He didn't call the police. He didn't call a therapist. Instead, he opened the camera app and began to record. In the video, later recovered by detectives, Michael is seen pleading with Tausha to work things out. His voice, once the smooth tool of a salesman, was now sharp with desperation. "I feel like you're backing me into a corner," he told her. It was a classic manipulator's script, the victim blaming of a man who refused to be the villain in his own story. As the house grew quiet and the children, Macy, Briley, Ammon, Sienna, and little Gavin, drifted off to sleep, the digital history of Michael's mind began to whisper the truth. Days earlier, between 10:41 a.m. and 11:21 a.m., Michael had sat at his computer and typed questions that would haunt the investigation. How loud is a 9mm gunshot? What does a gunshot sound like? Would a neighbor hear a gunshot in a garage? How loud is a .40 caliber pistol? He wasn't wondering about self-defense. He was testing the acoustics of murder. He wanted to know if the sound of his Springfield .40 OS&W would travel through the insulated walls of their luxurious home, or if the screams would be swallowed by the winter wind. The exact sequence of the next few hours is a nightmare reconstructed from blood spatter and ballistics. Michael didn't just snap. He moved through the house with the cold precision of an actuary. He went from room to room. First, Tausha, the woman he had promised to protect for 19 years. Then, Gail Earle, the 78-year-old grandmother who had come to help her daughter through a difficult time. And then, the children. One by one, Macy, the 17-year-old who had tried to warn the world. Briley, the 12-year-old who just wanted to be safe. The 7-year-old twins, Ammon and Sienna. And finally, 4-year-old Gavin. The silence that Michael had researched, the silence he so desperately wanted to preserve, finally fell. There were no calls to 911 that night. No neighbors reported hearing the sharp cracks of the .40 caliber rounds. The house on Albert Drive stood dark, a tomb of white siding and stone, while the rest of Enoch slept, unaware that its ideal family had been erased from the map. Michael Haight had finally achieved total control. He had ensured that no one would ever leave him again. He had backed himself into the corner he had filmed just hours before, and he had used a bullet to close the door behind him. The first ripples of unease didn't come from the family home, but from the digital ether. Tausha Haight was a woman of routine and punctuality. She had an online appointment scheduled for earlier that week, a meeting that meant more than just a calendar entry. It was a step toward her new, independent life. When she didn't log in, and when the phone calls from her family friend went straight to a voicemail that remained unreturned, the atmosphere in Enoch began to shift from quiet to cold. By 1:46 p.m., the worry had reached a breaking point. A friend, unable to sit with the mounting dread any longer, called the Enoch City Police Department. They requested a welfare check, a routine call in most towns, but in a place where the Haight's were the pillars of the community, it felt like an admission that something was fundamentally wrong. But before the patrol cars could even pull into the driveway, the house's secret had already been stumbled upon. A neighbor, perhaps noticing the lack of movement or simply checking in on a friend who hadn't answered the door, decided to let themselves in. When the officers arrived, they didn't just walk into a crime scene. They walked into a slaughterhouse disguised as a suburban oasis. The body camera footage from that day is a harrowing descent into a nightmare. They entered through the side door of the garage, the same garage where Michael had worried about the acoustics of a gunshot. They moved through the house with weapons drawn, but they quickly realized there was no one left to fight. In the master bedroom, the light of the family was gone. Tausha Haight and her mother, Gail Earle, were found lying on the master bed. They looked as if they had been caught in a moment of rest that turned into an eternity. On the floor of the same room lay 4-year-old Gavin, the baby of the family, silenced before he could ever truly begin to speak. The officers continued through the hallway, opening the doors to the children's bedrooms. In one room, they found the 7-year-old twins, Ammon and Sienna. In another, 12-year-old Briley. And finally, 17-year-old Macy, the girl who had seen the darkness coming years before anyone else was willing to admit it. Each of them had been shot in the head, some multiple times. They were in their beds, some still tucked under the covers, as if the monster they had been told to fear under their bed had actually been the one who tucked them in. And there, among the wreckage of the family he had built and then systematically destroyed, was Michael Haight. He had turned the weapon on himself, his reign of control ending in the most cowardly way possible, by ensuring he wouldn't have to live with the consequences of his actions. As the yellow tape was stretched across the front of the home on Albert Drive, another report was being filed just a few miles away in Cedar City. Michael's parents had called the police to report their son missing. His white Ford F-150 was parked at their house, but Michael was nowhere to be found. The two investigations collided in the late afternoon sun. The missing man wasn't missing. He was exactly where he wanted to be. At the center of a tragedy he had choreographed to the very last detail. The Mormon idyll hadn't just collapsed. It had been executed. The lead detectives didn't have to look far for a motive. Michael Haight, a man of precise habits, had left behind a digital and physical trail that served as his final, twisted testimony. In the master bedroom, near the bodies of the women he had once called his family, investigators recovered the weapon, a black Springfield .40 caliber handgun. But more chilling than the steel was the paper. Michael had left a suicide note. In most cases of family annihilation, these notes are filled with remorse or a distorted plea for mercy. But Michael Haight wasn't interested in mercy. He was interested in blame. The note was a cold, narcissistic manifesto. He didn't apologize for the 5 children lying dead in their beds. Instead, he lamented his own suffering. He wrote about the unbearable pain of the divorce, claiming he couldn't live without his family, not because he loved them, but because he could not fathom a world where they existed outside of his control. He blamed Tausha for breaking the family, framing his act of mass murder as a tragic, inevitable consequence of her desire for independence. As the investigators moved from the physical evidence to the digital, the facade Michael had built began to crumble even further. They seized his computers and cell phones, uncovering the 400-page shadow history that the community of Enoch had never seen. The digital forensics revealed a man who was obsessed with the mechanics of death. While his neighbors saw him at church, his search history showed a man calculating the distance sound travels through drywall. He hadn't just wondered if a 9mm was loud. He had researched how to ensure no one would come to the rescue. He had looked into the lethality of various calibers, seeking a way to ensure that his assets were disposed of with absolute certainty. But the most damning evidence didn't come from the night of the murders. It came from the years of silence that preceded it. Detectives began interviewing Tausha's inner circle, those few people she had finally started to trust with the truth. They told stories of a toxic patriarchy that had turned their home into a high-tech prison. The financial leash. Michael, as a successful insurance agent, controlled every cent. Tausha, despite managing a household of 7, had to justify every gallon of gas and every grocery bill. The digital panopticon. Friends revealed that Michael had installed spyware on Tausha's devices. He didn't just want to know where she was, he wanted to know what she was thinking. If she reached out to a divorce lawyer, he knew within minutes. The 2020 welfare check. Investigators revisited the 2020 report, the one that had been filed away and forgotten. They spoke to the social workers who had seen the red welts on the children's arms, who had heard Macy's whispered fears that her father was going to snap. The realization was sickening. The system hadn't just failed the Haight family, it had practically handed Michael the keys to their cells. Because Michael was a good man in the eyes of the community, a man with a clean record and a firm handshake, his violence was treated as a private family matter. Detectives also discovered that in the days leading up to the massacre, Michael had been liquidating his life. He had organized his office, left a final paycheck for his staff, and ensured his own affairs were in perfect order. He was a man who dealt in insurance, and he had ensured that his exit would be as controlled as his life. Neighbors, when questioned, struggled to reconcile the monster in the police report with the man who helped with yard work. He was just Mike, one neighbor told reporters, his voice trembling. He was the guy you'd call if your mower broke. This was the ultimate horror of the Enoch case. Michael Haight wasn't a stranger. He was the neighbor, the church member, the protector. He had spent 20 years convincing the world he was a guardian, all while he was carefully measuring the walls of the tomb he was building for his children. As the investigation wrapped up its first week, the question wasn't who had killed the Haight's. It was how a man could hide such a profound, murderous darkness in the bright, thin air of a Utah morning for so long. Michael had spent his life assessing risk, calculating premiums, and ensuring that every variable was accounted for. In his final act, he treated his family like a set of liabilities that needed to be wiped from the books. The 400-page official report details a path of violence that moved through the house with terrifying efficiency. Michael didn't just snap. He moved from room to room, extinguishing the lights of his children's lives while they were still in the safety of their beds. The horror of the Haight case isn't just in the act itself, but in the why. Because Michael died by his own hand, There would be no trial, no cross-examination of his motives, and no moment of justice for Tausha or the children. The legal system, which had already brushed aside the warning signs in 2020, was left with nothing but a closed file and 8 death certificates. In the weeks following the massacre, the town of Enoch was forced to look into a mirror. The interviews with friends and neighbors revealed a terrifying truth about the Mormon idyll. For years, Tausha had been living in a state of controlled terror, a reality hidden behind the Sunday dresses and the large, comfortable house. Michael's need for dominance was so absolute that he viewed his wife's petition for divorce not as a legal right, but as a theft of his property. The community's reaction was a mix of profound grief and a desperate attempt to protect the image of the town. At the funeral, thousands gathered to mourn the 5 children, Tausha and her mother Gail. But even in death, the facade Michael had built was hard to tear down. In the early days, some members of the community struggled to condemn the man they had known as a good neighbor, a hard worker, and a faithful provider. It was easier to view it as a sudden, inexplicable tragedy than to admit that a predator had been hiding in their pews for 20 years. But the 400 pages of evidence didn't lie. They spoke of a man who had been investigated for child abuse, a man who had been reported for his temper, and a man who had systematically isolated his wife until she felt she had no choice but to file for divorce, a decision that ultimately cost her everything. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.